The desert sun glinted off the polished metals adorning Captain William "Iron Bill" Harrington's dress uniform. At 63, his weathered face told the story of a lifetime of service that no commendation could fully capture. He stood ramrod straight despite the decades weighing on his frame, watching the anniversary ceremony at Fort Hood with eyes that had seen too much. 30 years, 3 decades since Operation Desert Storm. The thought settled in his chest like a round of depleted uranium. The garrison flag snapped in the Texas wind as the band played the national anthem. Bill's hand rose to his brow in a salute that had become as natural as breathing. Around him stood hundreds of veterans, families, and active duty soldiers, all gathered to commemorate what many called the last good war. Clean, decisive, righteous. If only they knew, he thought. A voice from the podium carried across the parade ground. And now, to say a few words about the historic 73 Easting Battle, we welcome Silver Star recipient, Captain William Harrington. The applause washed over him as he approached the microphone. His gaze swept across the crowd until he found them, 3 men seated in the front row. His crew, his brothers. Marcus Doc Wilson sat with the careful posture of a physician, his oncologist's hands folded neatly in his lap. At 58, he'd traded his gunner's position for a doctor's office, saving lives in a different way now. Beside him, Thomas Eagle Eye Martinez fidgeted with his tie, the same restlessness that had made him check and recheck the tank systems now channeled into building a construction business. And Carlos Grease Rodriguez, still built like the powerhouse that had loaded 1,000-pound shells, now designing engines instead of maintaining them. They'd come. After all these years, they'd answered his call one more time. "Thank you," Bill began, his voice carrying the gravel of command that had never quite left him. 30 years ago, I had the honor of commanding the finest tank crew ever assembled. We called ourselves Steelhammer, though our superiors had other names for us. A knowing chuckle rippled through the veterans in attendance. Our M1A1 Abrams, call sign Thunderbolt, was the tip of the spears during the 73 Easting engagement. What the history books will tell you is that American armor devastated the Iraqi Republican Guard that day. What they won't tell you is how it felt inside those steel beasts. Bill paused, the memories washing over him in vivid detail. Imagine sitting inside a 70-ton coffin, moving at 40 miles per hour across terrain no man was meant to traverse. Sand infiltrating every seal, every crevice. Temperature inside reaching 130 degrees. The smell of sweat, hydraulic fluid, and gunpowder becoming so familiar, you'd recognize it in your sleep for the rest of your life. His gaze locked with Doc Wilson's. They both knew he was deviating from the prepared remarks. And then contact. Gunner, sabot, tank. The words that launched a ballet of violence. Martinez identifying targets through his thermal sight. Wilson swinging that 120 main gun with surgical precision. Rodriguez loading rounds faster than any loader in the battalion. And me, making the calls that would determine whether we lived or died. The crowd had gone silent, captivated. We engaged and destroyed 6 T-72s in under 7 minutes. But the history books don't tell you about the 7th. They don't tell you about Operation Iron Shield. They don't tell you what those tanks were protecting. A subtle change swept through the officials seated on the stage. The current base commander shifted uncomfortably. A visiting Pentagon representative leaned to whisper something to an aide. Bill felt Doc's warning gaze, but he'd carried this weight for too long. "But that's a story for another day," he conceded, returning to the script. "Today, we honor all who served, who did their duty when their nation called. Thank you." The applause seemed tinged with relief as Bill returned to his seat. The ceremony continued with more speeches, a flyover of Apache helicopters, and finally the unveiling of a monument depicting an M1 Abrams in battle position. "You nearly went off the reservation there, Captain," Doc muttered, as they stood for the closing prayer. "Old habits," Bill replied. After the ceremony, the 4 men gathered at the static display of vintage armor. Thunderbolt wasn't among them. Their tank had been decommissioned and sent to the National Armor Museum years ago. They'd visited her there often, each making the pilgrimage in their own time, never telling the others. "You look good, sir," Rodriguez said, his accent still carrying the traces of his El Paso upbringing. "Still fit enough to climb into a commander's hatch?" "Try me, Grease," Bill challenged with a grin that shaved decades off his face. "I could still outrun you to the motor pool." Martinez laughed. "Remember when the captain caught you sleeping during that night fire exercise in Germany? Made you run laps around the tank in full mop gear. How could I forget? Nearly passed out from heat stroke. Rodriguez shook his head. Best lesson I ever learned, though, never caught me slacking again. They fell into the easy rhythm of old comrades, trading stories that grew more outlandish with each retelling. But beneath the laughter ran an undercurrent of something unspoken, something they'd all carried home from the desert. As the afternoon wore on, they made their way to the officers' club, claiming a corner table away from the younger soldiers celebrating the day with less restraint. To absent friends, Bill proposed once drinks arrived, raising his bourbon. They all knew who he meant. Lieutenant Frank Chambers, their first gunner, killed when an Iraqi mortar struck their position during a maintenance halt. Private James Lewis, who'd filled in as loader for one mission when Rodriguez had dysentery, now buried in Arlington after Afghanistan took him. Absent friends, they echoed, glasses clinking. Wilson set his drink down carefully. So, Bill, why the reunion? Your message said it was important. Bill had been wondering the same thing about Wilson. The man looked thinner than he should, his complexion ashen beneath his dark skin. Can't an old tank commander just want to see his crew? Cut the crap, sir, Martinez said, the formality softened by his smile. You used our old emergency rally code in your email, Bravo 6 Echo. That means something's wrong. Bill sighed. They still knew him too well. I got a call from Eleanor Mitchell at the National Armor Museum last week, he said, lowering his voice. Things aren't good. Dr. Mitchell, the curator, Rodriguez asked, what's happening? Budget cuts. The Department of Defense is pulling their support funding. They're saying it's austerity measures, but there's more to it. Bill leaned in, his voice dropping further. They're closing the museum, boys, permanently. The news hit them like a physical blow. What happens to the collection? Martinez demanded, his businessman's mind immediately calculating assets and liabilities. Some pieces will go to other museums. The more valuable ones, Bill's jaw tightened. They're being sold to private collectors, foreign buyers mostly. And Thunderbolt? Wilson asked the question they were all thinking. Already on the manifest, some oil sheik or Russian oligarch. Eleanor wouldn't say who. But she did say they were moving fast. 30 days and our girl's gone. Silence fell over this table. Thunderbolt wasn't just a machine to them. She was the fifth member of their crew, the steel womb that had carried them through hell and brought them home again. There has to be something we can do, Rodriguez finally said, his fingers tracing condensation patterns on his glass. Bill's eyes hardened with a resolve his crew recognized from missions past. There is. That's why I called you here. He laid out what Eleanor had told him. The museum needed $1 million to secure its immediate future. The DoD had withdrawn support as part of a larger initiative to modernize military heritage presentations, whatever bureaucratic doublespeak that meant. $1 million? Martinez whistled. That's steep, even for a good cause. I've got some savings, Wilson offered. Not much, but it's not about writing a check, Bill cut in. It's about making a statement, showing them what these vehicles mean, what they represent. You've got that look, Captain, Rodriguez said warily. The one you had when we were about to do something either brilliant or suicidal. Bill smiled, the desert warrior momentarily visible beneath the aging veteran. Eleanor gave me access to Thunderbolt. She's in rough shape, boys. Engines seized, fire controls degraded, but she's all there. What are you suggesting? Wilson asked, though his expression showed he already knew. I'm suggesting we bring her back. Full restoration. Get her running again. Martinez snorted. That's insane. Do you have any idea what it would take to restore a 30-year-old Abrams? The parts alone would be nearly impossible to source, Rodriguez finished, but his eyes had taken on a calculating gleam. Except you worked for General Dynamics for 15 years after you got out, Bill said, designing the M1A2 upgrades. And Doc here has connections at every VA hospital in 3 states, Martinez realized, warming to the idea. He could reach thousands of veterans. And you, Wilson nodded to Martinez, built a construction empire from nothing. Marketing, fundraising. Son of a bitch, Martinez laughed. The captain's putting the crew back together for one last mission. Bill leaned back, watching his plan take root among them. Not just restoration, a national tour, the last tank standing. We show people what these machines mean, what the men who crewed them sacrificed. And raise the money to save the museum, Rodriguez concluded. More than that, Bill said, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had once guided them through sandstorms and enemy fire. We remind the country what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. We honor every tanker who never came home. And we make sure a Thunderbolt stays where she belongs, on American soil. One by one they nodded, Even facing retirement, medical issues, financial troubles, and family obligations, they were still a crew, still responded to their captain's command. One question, Wilson said, why us? Why not go to the Tank Battalion Association or one of the veterans groups? Bill hesitated, because it's not just about saving Thunderbolt. There's something inside her that needs to stay buried, or needs to finally come to light. I haven't decided which. The jovial mood evaporated as quickly as morning dew in the desert. Iron Shield, Martinez whispered, the operation name sounding like a curse. Bill nodded. Someone at the Pentagon is very interested in making sure certain tanks, certain records, disappear overseas where they'll never be examined too closely. After 30 years, Rodriguez asked incredulously, who would even care anymore? Someone who rose very high after the war, Bill replied. Someone with stars on their shoulders and blood on their hands. They all fell silent, considering the implications. I'm in, Wilson finally said, but you should know, I'm in treatment. Stage 3 pancreatic. The prognosis isn't good. The revelation hit Bill like a round to the glacis plate. Marcus, the strongest of them all, facing an enemy none of them could fight. All the more reason to do this now, Martinez said, reaching over to grip Wilson's shoulder. While we still can. Rodriguez nodded. Count me in, Captain. I got laid off last month anyway. Company moved production to Malaysia. Said American engineers cost too much. They looked to Martinez, the most successful among them, the one with the most to lose. My company's underwater, he admitted. Housing crash hit us hard. Banks calling in loans. This might be my last hurrah before bankruptcy court. Bill looked around at his broken crew, sick, unemployed, facing financial ruin. Just like America itself, he thought. Still standing, but damaged in ways that didn't show on the surface. Then it's settled, he said, raising his glass again. Steel hammer rides again. For Thunderbolt. For ourselves. For every tanker who ever rode into hell inside American steel. Steel hammer, they echoed, clinking glasses once more. As they parted ways that evening, WWII and Bevan, planning to reconvene at the museum the following week, none of them noticed the man in the crisp suit watching from across the bar. The man who made a discreet call as soon as they left. Sir, they're planning something, he said quietly. Harrington and his old crew. Something about the Abrams at the museum. Yes, sir, that tank. No, they didn't mention the compartment specifically, but Harrington referenced Iron Shield. Understood. I'll stay on it. The man ended the call, signaled for another drink, and settled in to wait. The game that had begun in the desert 30 years ago was entering its final move. Chapter 2. Shocking news. The National Armor Museum sprawled across 30 acres of prime real estate outside Fort Knox, Kentucky. Once the pride of the Army's armor branch, the facility had seen better days. Paint peeled from the walls of the main exhibition hall. Water stains marred the ceiling panels, and the outdoor vehicles, once meticulously maintained, now showed the ravages of weather and neglect. Bill's rental car crunched across the gravel parking lot, nearly empty on a Tuesday morning. He'd driven through the night, too restless to sleep in a motel, his mind racing with possibilities and memories. The museum had been his pilgrimage site for decades. Every year on the anniversary of 73 Easting, he'd come to stand before Thunderbolt, to press his palm against her armor and remember, to apologize to those who hadn't come home. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell waited at the main entrance, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her posture as rigid as any drill sergeant's. At 55, she'd spent her career preserving military history, fighting bureaucracy with the same tenacity that battlefield commanders fought the enemy. Captain Harrington, she greeted him, extending her hand, right on time, as always. Just Bill now, Elena, he reminded her, taking her hand. Haven't been captain in a long time. Once a tank commander, always a tank commander, she replied with a sad smile. Come, she's waiting for you. They walked through the cavernous main hall, past Shermans and Pattons, Stewarts and Chaffees, the steel genealogy of American armored warfare. Each vehicle told a story, the desperate improvisation of early war models, the hard-learned lessons of combat encoded in welded armor and sloped turrets, the technological leaps born of necessity and sacrifice. Attendance is down 60% from last year, Eleanor said as they walked. The school tours have all but stopped. Kids today don't care about tanks. They have video games with better graphics. It's not just the kids, Bill noted. We're losing the connection to our history. The World War II generation is nearly gone, Korea, Vietnam, those veterans are disappearing too. And Desert Storm is ancient history to today's recruits, Eleanor agreed. Most weren't even born when you fought there. They passed through the set of double doors into a separate wing. Guardians of Freedom, the modern era, read the sign. Inside stood the armored vehicles of America's more recent conflicts. Bradley fighting vehicles, Strykers, and in the center of the room an M1A1 Abrams. Thunderbolt. Bill stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. Even after all these years, the sight of her hit him with physical force. The tank sat on a raised platform, her 120mm main gun elevated slightly, as if ready to engage targets beyond the museum walls. Her desert tan paint had been meticulously preserved, though without the dust and grime of combat, she looked almost sanitized. Too clean, too perfect, like the history they taught in schools. All glory and technological superiority, none of the blood and confusion. Bill approached slowly, circling the display. The tactical markings were all there, including the unit insignia and the unofficial steel hammer painted on the turret bustle rack. 3 kill marks adorned the barrel, the official count from 73 Easting. Not 7, never 7. When was the last time anyone started her up? He asked, running his hand along the drive sprocket. Not since she arrived here in 1996, Eleanor replied. The preservation protocol required draining all fluids, disconnecting the batteries. Bill nodded, continuing his inspection with the methodical precision of a pre-combat check. The rubber track blocks were cracked with age. The hatches had been welded shut, standard museum practice to prevent curious visitors from climbing inside. The optics had been removed, replaced with non-functional replicas. "What's your real plan, Eleanor?" he asked without looking at her. "You didn't call me just to say goodbye to an old friend." Eleanor glanced around, ensuring they were alone, then lowered her voice. "Follow me." She led him to her office, a cluttered space filled with books, maps, and artifacts awaiting cataloging. Closing the door, she pulled a file from her desk and handed it to him. "This came through last week. Official directive from the Department of Defense. They're calling it the Heritage Streamlining Initiative." Bill opened the file, page after page of bureaucratic language, disguising a simple truth: the systematic dismantling of America's armored heritage. "Jesus," he muttered, flipping through the document. "They're liquidating everything?" "Not everything. The historically significant pieces will go to the Smithsonian or West Point Museum. A Sherman, maybe a Patton. The rest..." She trailed off. "The rest gets sold to the highest bidder," Bill finished, his jaw tightening. "And Thunderbolt isn't considered historically significant? One Abrams is much like another, according to the assessment team. They're keeping the one from the Gulf War victory parade. Better condition, better story for the public." Bill slammed the file shut. Better story because it's sanitized, because it never fired a shot in anger, because it doesn't have secrets welded into its hull. Eleanor's eyes widened. "So it's true, there really is something inside her." Bill looked up sharply. "What have you heard?" "Rumors, whispers, that certain tanks came back from Desert Storm with more than just battle damage. That records were hidden, evidence concealed." She leaned forward. "Is that why they're so eager to get rid of her? To sell her to someone who won't know what to look for?" Bill stood and paced the small office, decades of ingrained operational security warring with the need for truth. "Who's behind the initiative, Eleanor? Who signed the order?" She hesitated, then said, "General Maxwell Stone, Deputy Secretary of Defense now." The name hit Bill like a physical blow. Stone. The young colonel who'd given the order for Iron Shield, who'd sworn them all to secrecy afterward, who'd built his stars on their silence. "Stone," he repeated, the name tasting like sand and blood in his mouth. "Should have known." "There's more," Eleanor said, her voice dropping further. "I did some digging. The buyer for Thunderbolt isn't some sheikh or oligarch. It's a private military contractor. Black site operations. They're going to strip her for parts, study her armor composition. She'll be scrap metal within a month." Bill felt something snap inside him. The final thread of restraint that had held him together since the war. "Not going to happen," he said, his voice taking on the command tone that had once cut through the chaos of battle. "I don't care what it costs, what strings we have to pull. Thunderbolt stays here." Eleanor smiled grimly. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already delayed the transfer paperwork. Cited irregularities in the provenance documentation. It buys us maybe 30 days. 30 days, Bill repeated. Not much time. It's all we have. After that, she's gone." Eleanor hesitated. "There's one more thing you should know. The welds on the commander's hatch. They weren't done by our preservation team. They were already there when she arrived. Someone sealed that tank before she ever left the Middle East. Bill's expression hardened. That tracks. Stone wouldn't want anyone accessing that compartment, especially not the investigators who came later. What's in there, Bill? What are you and Stone fighting over after all these years? Bill sank back into the chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 63 years. The truth, he said simply, about a mission that never happened, about orders that were never given, about a village that was never there. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. And documents, Bill continued after a long pause. Records of chemical weapons deployments, not by the Iraqis, by us, against our own troops. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Gulf War syndrome, she whispered. All those veterans who came home sick, who were told it was in their heads, who died while the government denied everything. Stone tested an experimental weapon on our own soldiers, Bill confirmed. He needed to know if our protective gear could withstand it, so he deployed it against an Iraqi position where he knew American forces would soon advance. And you have proof inside Thunderbolt? We were supposed to destroy it. The whole mission was black. No records, no reports. But my gunner, Wilson, he collected samples, took photographs, kept a journal. When we got back to base, he hid everything in a sealed ammunition container and welded it into a compartment behind the commander's station. Why didn't you come forward before now? Bill's laugh was hollow. Who would believe us? 4 tank crewmen against a rising star colonel. And then the years passed. Wilson got sick, like thousands of other Gulf vets. We all tried to move on, to forget. But Stone never forgot, Eleanor realized. He's been tracking the tank all these years, waiting for a chance to make it disappear for good. And now he has it. Bill stood again, decision made. I need to get inside that tank, Eleanor, today. She shook her head. Impossible. The security system can be bypassed, Bill finished. You know it? I know it. The question is whether you're willing to risk your job to expose a 30-year-old war crime. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a keyring. The cameras in the modern era gallery are down for maintenance today, she said carefully. Between 2 and 4 p.m., the guard makes his rounds in the World War II section. The service entrance near the restoration workshop will be unlocked. I'll be in a budget meeting off-site all afternoon. Bill took the keys, understanding the unspoken agreement. No knowledge, no complicity, plausible deniability. Thank you, he said simply. Don't thank me yet. Eleanor stood and gathered her papers. Even if you get what you're looking for, what then? $1 million in 30 days. That's a miracle, not a plan. I've got a crew, Bill replied. Best damn tank crew that ever rolled through hell. If anyone can pull off a miracle, it's them. I hope you're right, Eleanor said, heading for the door. For all our sakes. As she left, Bill pulled out his phone and sent a text to the group chat he'd set up with his old crew. Mission is go. Target confirmed. Rally at Firebase Bravo. The reply from Doc came almost immediately. Roger that, Captain. We're wheels up at 1800. From Martinez, bringing specialized equipment. Sit tight. From Rodriguez, setting up supply lines. Save some action for us. Reading their responses, Bill felt a rush of the old feeling, that pre-combat mixture of fear and exhilaration. The knowledge that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. He had 4 hours until the security gap Eleanor had mentioned. 4 hours to plan how to break into a national museum, cut through welds on a priceless historical artifact, and extract evidence of a war crime that powerful people had spent 3 decades concealing. Just another day in the Abrams, he thought grimly. Chapter 3. Assembling the Force. Bill spent the afternoon reconnoitering the museum grounds with the same attention to detail he'd once given to Iraqi defensive positions. The building's security was minimal. Budget cuts had reduced the guard staff to a single watchman who made predictable rounds. The alarm system was outdated, covering only the main entrances and the most valuable exhibits. Thunderbolt, ironically, wasn't considered valuable enough to warrant special protection. At precisely 2:15 p.m., Bill slipped through the service entrance using Eleanor's keys. The restoration workshop beyond smelled of metal, oil, and solvent, scents that transported him instantly back to the motor pool at Fort Hood. The familiar environment steadied him as he gathered the tools he'd need, an angle grinder with a cutting wheel, pry bars, heavy gloves, and a flashlight. Moving silently through the back quarters of the museum, he reached the modern era gallery without encountering anyone. The space felt different now, darker, more intimate, as if the machines themselves recognized a kindred spirit in their midst. He approached Thunderbolt with reverence. This wasn't just a tank. This was the vessel that had carried him and his men through the Valley of Death. Her armor had protected them from enemy fire. Her gun had delivered their retribution. Her engine had carried them home when so many others had not returned. "Hello, old girl," he murmured, patting her flank. "Sorry about what I'm about to do." The commander's hatch had been welded shut with a precision that spoke of urgency rather than craftsmanship. Bill ran his fingers along the seam, feeling for the weakest point, then positioned the angle grinder. The cutting wheel screamed against the metal, sending sparks cascading down the side of the turret. Bill worked methodically, making a neat incision around 3/4 of the hatch circumference. The noise seemed deafening in the empty museum, but he knew from Eleanor's intelligence that the guard was currently on the opposite side of the building. After 10 minutes of careful cutting, Bill set aside the grinder and inserted a pry bar into the gap he'd created. With a grunt of effort, he levered the hatch upward. Metal screamed in protest, then gave way with a sudden crack that echoed through the gallery. Bill froze, listening for any response, but the museum remained silent. Satisfied, he lifted the hatch fully open and peered into the darkness of the turret. The interior of the Abrams was cramped by civilian standards, but to Bill, it was home. The commander's station was directly beneath the hatch, a seat surrounded by periscopes, controls, and communications equipment. All had been partially disassembled for the museum display, with key components removed. Bill lowered himself inside, the muscle memory of thousands of similar movements guiding him despite the decades that had passed. His flashlight beam swept across the familiar space, the gunner's position to his left, the loader's station behind, the driver's compartment forward and below. "Now where did you hide it, Doc?" he muttered, examining the area behind his seat. The space appeared unmodified at first glance, but Bill knew better. He ran his hands along the turret wall until his fingers found what they were seeking: a slight irregularity in the metal, a weld seam that didn't belong. Using the pry bar again, he worked at the edge of the concealed compartment. The metal was thinner here, part of the internal firewall, rather than the main armor. It bent under his persistent effort, then tore open to reveal a cavity about the size of a bread box. Inside sat a standard 120mm ammunition container, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Stenciled across its side in Wilson's neat hand was a simple identification: iron shield evidence, open only in event of our deaths. Bill's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the container. It was heavier than he expected, perhaps 10 pounds of material inside. What secrets had his crew preserved? What nightmares had they sealed away? The sound of voices from the main hall snapped Bill back to the present. The guard was returning early. With practiced efficiency, Bill extracted himself from the tank, pulling the container after him. There was no time to reseal the hatch properly. He'd have to hope that Eleanor could explain away the damage as part of a maintenance inspection. Bill slipped the container into his backpack and made his way back through the restoration workshop, exiting through the service door just as the guard's flashlight beams swept through the main gallery. Outside, he walked unhurriedly to his rental car, placed the backpack carefully on the passenger seat, and drove away from the museum with deliberate casualness. Only when he was miles away, on the interstate heading toward Lexington, did he allow himself to breathe normally again. The weight of what he carried, not just physically, but historically, morally, pressed down on him with each mile. His phone rang. Martinez. "Captain, we're at the rendezvous point, motel off exit 126. "Roger that, ETA 20 minutes, Bill replied. "Package secured." "Any complications?" Martinez's voice carried the tension of the former scout he was. "Forced entry. Evidence of intrusion impossible to conceal." A pause. Timeline accelerated then. "Affirmative. 30 days just became a lot less." Bill ended the call and pressed the accelerator, pushing the rental car faster along the interstate. The Kentucky countryside blurred past his windows, rolling hills and horse farms that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the conflict now brewing. The Bluegrass Lodge Motel had seen better days, its neon sign flickering half-heartedly in the gathering dusk. Bill parked beside Martinez's Suburban and Rodriguez's pickup truck. Room 117 had its curtains drawn, but he could see light around the edges. He knocked. Too quick, one slow, too quick. The old recognition pattern. Wilson opened the door, his medical bag beside him as always. "Captain, right on time." The room beyond was already transformed into an impromptu command center. Martinez had set up a laptop and portable printer on the desk. Maps of Kentucky and surrounding states were spread across one bed. Rodriguez knelt beside an open equipment case containing tools and electronic devices Bill didn't recognize. "Secure the door," Bill ordered as he entered, slipping automatically into command mode. Rodriguez complied, adding a chair wedged under the handle for good measure. Bill placed his backpack on the second bed and stepped back. The four men gathered around it, none making a move to open it. The weight of the moment hung in the air between them. "We should document this," Wilson said finally, breaking the silence. "Whatever's in there, it needs to be recorded. Witnessed." Martinez nodded, setting up his phone on a tripod. "I'll record it." "Before we open it," Bill said, looking each man in the eye, "I want to be clear about what we're doing. This isn't just about saving a tank or even a museum. This is about bringing truth to light after 30 years of darkness. Once we go down this road, there's no turning back. Stone will come after us with everything he has." "Stone and his cronies have been coming after us for 30 years, Wilson replied, his physician's hand steady despite the tremor in his voice. "My cancer didn't just happen. Rodriguez's company didn't just decide to outsource. Martinez's loans didn't just get called in. They've been squeezing us, Captain. Slowly, methodically, making sure we stay quiet." The others nodded in somber agreement. They'd all felt it over the years. The subtle pressure, the opportunities that vanished, the setbacks that came at critical moments. Too consistent to be coincidence, too insidious to fight. "Then it's unanimous," Bill said. "We finish what we started in the desert. We bring Iron Shield into the light." Martinez activated the camera. "Recording?" With reverent care, Bill opened the backpack and removed the ammunition container. The tape seal cracked as he lifted the lid, releasing the faintest scent of desert sand and chemical preservative. Inside, meticulously organized and labeled, lay the evidence they'd risked their careers, their lives to preserve. A leather-bound journal, Wilson's medical observations of affected troops. A roll of 35mm film negatives in a lead-lined container. A sealed glass vial containing soil samples. Manila envelopes marked mission orders and casualty reports. And at the bottom, most damning of all, a microcassette labeled Colonel Stone, pre-mission briefing. "My God," Rodriguez whispered, "you recorded him." Wilson nodded grimly. "Insurance policy. Never thought we'd need it." Bill lifted the cassette. "This is it. This proves Stone knew exactly what he was doing. That he ordered us to secure that village, knowing full well it had been dosed with our own chemical agents. That he used American soldiers as test subjects." "Does anyone still have equipment that can play this?" Martinez wondered aloud, examining the obsolete recording medium. "I do," Rodriguez said. "In my garage, old-school repair kit for vintage audio." "Good," Bill nodded. "But first, let's examine everything. Document it properly." For the next 3 hours, they methodically cataloged the contents of the container. Wilson's journal detailed the symptoms he'd observed in troops who'd entered the contaminated village. Symptoms identical to what would later be called Gulf War syndrome. The film contained photos of the operation, including shots of unusual canister munitions being loaded onto aircraft at a forward operating base. The mission orders, bearing Stone's signature, explicitly directed their tank platoon to secure the village of Al-Bahar following an experimental weapons deployment. The casualty reports listed 17 American soldiers who'd fallen ill after entering the village. All cases later attributed to unknown environmental factors. "This is everything we need," Martinez said as they finished. "With this evidence, we can prove what happened. We can expose Stone. And get justice for thousands of sick veterans," Wilson added, the personal stake evident in his voice. Bill wasn't celebrating. He was reading the mission orders again, his expression darkening. "There's something wrong," he said. "These orders, they're not what I remember. Stone told us to secure the village after an Iraqi chemical attack. This says experimental weapons deployment, but it doesn't specify whose weapons." "It was ours," Wilson insisted. "The residue analysis I ran in the field." "I believe you," Bill cut him off. "I'm saying Stone covered his tracks. These orders are deliberately vague. He can claim he meant Iraqi experimental weapons. It's our word against his." The realization dampened their earlier optimism. Decades in the military had taught them all how the system worked, how plausible deniability was built into every questionable operation. "The recording," Rodriguez said suddenly. "If you recorded the briefing, that would be unambiguous." "If it survived," Wilson cautioned, 30 years in that container, exposed to temperature extremes. "We need to hear it," Bill decided. "How fast can you get your equipment here?" "It's in my truck," Rodriguez replied. "Never leave home without my tools." While Rodriguez retrieved his repair kit, Martinez worked on digitizing the photographic negatives using a portable scanner. Wilson transcribed key passages from his journal. Bill spread out a map of the area around Fort Knox, marking potential rally points and escape routes. Old habits from their battlefield days reasserted themselves, each man focusing on his specialty, trusting the others to handle theirs. Rodriguez returned with a battered toolbox and a case containing vintage audio equipment. With the delicate touch that had once loaded 1,000-pound shells, he set up a small cassette player, connecting it to a laptop via an audio interface. "Moment of truth," he said, inserting the microcassette. They gathered around as he pressed play. Static filled the room, then cleared to reveal voices, distant, scratchy, but intelligible. "Operational security is paramount." Stone's voice, younger but unmistakable. "This mission does not exist on paper. Is that understood, Captain Harrington?" "Yes, sir." Bill's own voice from 3 decades ago. "My crew is reliable, but I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." "You're dealing with a village that has been exposed to a chemical agent. Your mission is to secure the area, prevent enemy forces from entering, and report on the effectiveness of the deployment." "What kind of agent, sir? What should my men be prepared for?" A pause, then Stone's voice lower. "That's need to know, Captain. And you don't need to know. Your men will be in M1A1s with NBC protection. They'll be fine." "With respect, sir, fine isn't good enough when we're talking about chemical weapons. Whose weapons are these?" Another pause longer. Then, "This is a field test of compound DB-212. That's all you need to know." "DB-212? I've never heard of—" "You wouldn't have. It's one of ours. New development, highly classified." Gasps filled the motel room as the recording continued. "One of ours? Sir, are you saying we're deploying chemical weapons? That's against—" "Against what, Captain? International law? We're not signatories to the chemical weapons ban. And this isn't deployment, it's a field test. Limited exposure scenario. In an enemy village. In an abandoned enemy village. Intelligence confirms it was evacuated yesterday. And if intelligence is wrong, if there are civilians, then that's unfortunate but acceptable. This is war, Captain. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice. And our own troops? The ones who'll move through that village after us?" Stone's voice turned icy. "They'll be contributing to vital research that will protect future soldiers. Consider it their patriotic duty." The recording continued for another minute, details about timing, positioning, extraction protocols. Then it ended abruptly. Silence filled the motel room. The 4 men looked at each other, the weight of what they just heard settling over them like depleted uranium armor. "We've got him," Martinez finally said. "This is definitive proof." "It's proof of something unconscionable," Wilson agreed. "Using our own troops as guinea pigs. Exposing them without consent, without protection." Rodriguez shook his head in disgust. And he knew. He knew they'd get sick, knew some would die, and he covered it up. Let them suffer without treatment, without acknowledgement. Bill remained silent, staring at the cassette player as if it might contain some further revelation. "Captain?" Wilson prompted. "What are you thinking?" When Bill finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of command and the exhaustion of a burden carried too long. "I'm thinking Stone won't go down without a fight. I'm thinking we need to be very careful about how we use this. And I'm thinking we still have a museum to save." "How do the two connect?" Rodriguez asked. "The museum and Iron Shield?" "They connect through Thunderbolt," Bill replied. "She's the physical evidence. The tank that was there. The container was hidden inside her. If Stone gets his hands on her, he'll destroy everything, the tank, the evidence, and probably us." Martinez's business mind clicked into gear. "So we turn this into leverage. We approach Stone privately, show him what we have, force him to reverse the decision on the museum." "Blackmail?" Wilson asked, his physician's ethics troubled by the suggestion. "Justice," Martinez corrected. "He's the one who committed the crime. We're just making sure he doesn't profit from it anymore." Bill shook his head. "Stone's too powerful now. He'd have us discredited, committed, or killed before we could go public. We need a different approach." He stood and paced the small room, the tactician in him plotting moves and countermoves. "We restore Thunderbolt," he decided. "We get her running again. We make her the centerpiece of a national campaign to save the museum. We build public support so strong that Stone can't touch her without raising questions." "And the evidence?" Wilson asked. "We digitize everything, create multiple backups, store them in secure locations, and we prepare to release it all if Stone makes a move against us." Rodriguez nodded slowly. Mutually assured destruction, old Cold War doctrine. It worked then, Bill said grimly. Let's hope it works now. Martinez began typing on his laptop. I'll start working on the campaign strategy, the last tank standing. We'll need social media, traditional press, veterans organizations. I'll handle the technical restoration plan, Rodriguez added. Parts sourcing, maintenance schedule, testing protocols. Wilson looked at his hands, surgeon's hands that had once loaded tank shells with lethal precision. I'll digitize the medical evidence, and I'll reach out to my contacts at the VA. There are doctors who have been fighting for Gulf War syndrome recognition for decades. Bill watched his crew snap into action, pride swelling in his chest. 30 years older, facing personal battles none of them had anticipated, yet still functioning as a unit, still responding to the mission. First priority is securing Thunderbolt, he said, bringing them back to focus. After today's break-in, Eleanor will only be able to delay Stone's people for a day, maybe two. We need to move the tank before they do. Move it where? Rodriguez asked. That thing weighs 70 tons. Not without its power pack and tracks, Bill corrected. The museum removed the engine and transmission years ago, the hull and turret together, maybe 30 tons. Heavy, but manageable with the right equipment. Martinez was already on his phone. My company still has the heavy haulers, lowboys rated for 80 tons. Use them for moving construction equipment. Can you get one here by tomorrow night? Bill asked. I can do better than that. I can get two here with escort vehicles and all the necessary permits. Totally legal transport operation. Good, we'll need a destination, somewhere secure with facilities for restoration work. Rodriguez considered for a moment. My brother-in-law owns a farm outside Louisville, has a big machine shop for his agricultural equipment. Plenty of space, private property, no questions asked. Perfect. Rodriguez, coordinate with him. Martinez, arrange the transport. Wilson, you and I will go back to the museum tomorrow to prep Thunderbolt for movement. We'll need Eleanor's help to access the main doors and loading dock. The plan was coming together with the precision that had once made them the tip of the spear in history's last great tank battle. But as Bill looked at his aging crew, Wilson with his cancer, Martinez facing bankruptcy, Rodriguez unemployed, he felt a stab of doubt. They weren't young men anymore. This wasn't the desert, and Stone wasn't an enemy tank commander who could be defeated with a well-placed sabot round. One day at a time, he murmured, an old tanker's mantra for surviving when the odds seemed insurmountable, one target at a time. As they continued planning into the night, none of them noticed the sedan parked across the street, its driver watching the motel room through high-powered optics. None of them saw him make a call, speaking quietly into a secure phone. Sir, they've accessed the container. They have the recording. Yes, sir. They're planning to move the tank tomorrow night. Understood. Continuing surveillance. In his office at the Pentagon, General Maxwell Stone set down his phone and stared out the window at the Washington Monument gleaming in the distance. 30 years of careful career building, of strategic silences and calculated promotions, all threatened by a rusting tank and a group of aging veterans who didn't know when to let the past die. Find out who else they've contacted, he told his aide, and accelerate the tank's transfer. I want it gone by noon tomorrow. The first shots in a new kind of tank battle had been fired. And like the desert warfare they'd all once mastered, victory would go to whoever controlled the high ground. In this case, the moral high ground of American public opinion. Bill Harrington had been a tactical genius in the desert. Stone had always acknowledged that. But this was Washington, Stone's battlefield. And here he never lost. Chapter 4, Ghosts of War. The desert stretched before them, an endless ocean of sand under a midnight blue sky. Bill stood in the commander's hatch of Thunderbolt, scanning the horizon through night vision goggles that turned the world an eerie green. The tank column moved in formation across the featureless terrain, each vehicle maintaining precise distance from the others. Gunner Sabot, tank, Bill ordered, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Identified, Wilson acknowledged from the gunner's position below. Fire! On the way! The main gun roared, sending a depleted uranium penetrator downrange at over a mile per second. Through his thermal sight, Bill watched the round impact an Iraqi T-72, punching through its frontal armor as if it were cardboard. The enemy tank erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that sent its turret spinning into the air. Target destroyed, Wilson reported clinically. Driver, adjust course, heading 045, Bill commanded. Maintain speed. Roger 045, Rodriguez acknowledged from the driver's compartment. The village appeared on the horizon. A cluster of mud brick buildings barely distinguishable from the surrounding desert. As they approached, Bill noticed the stillness. No movement, no signs of life. "Command, this is Steel Hammer," he radioed. "Village appears deserted, proceeding with security sweep." "Steel Hammer Command," came the reply in Colonel Stone's voice. "Secure the perimeter. Report any unusual observations." Bill felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. "Rogers, Steel Hammer out." They encircled the village, 4 M1A1 Abrams, creating a steel perimeter around the cluster of buildings. Through his thermal sights, Bill scanned for heat signatures that would indicate human presence. Nothing. "I don't like this, sir," Martinez said over the intercom. "Intel said this place was an Iraqi chemical weapons storage site. Where are the guards, the security?" "Stay alert," Bill replied. "Wilson, anything on thermals?" "Negative, Captain. Wait, I've got something. Building on the north side. Heat signature, but it's wrong." "Define wrong." "Not human, not vehicle. More like a pool of heat, spreading." Bill switched his own optics to thermal. Wilson was right. The northern building showed a strange heat pattern, like liquid fire seeping from its foundations. "Rodriguez, move us closer, carefully." The tank advanced slowly toward the anomalous building. As they approached, Bill noticed a metallic odor penetrating even the filtered air of the tank's NBC system. "Gas masks," he ordered. "Full protection now." The crew donned their masks with practiced efficiency. Through the restricted vision of his mask, Bill continued to observe the building. The strange heat signature was expanding, flowing across the ground like water. "Command, Steelhammer, we've got an unknown substance leaking from the target building. Possible chemical agent, requesting guidance." Static answered him, then, "Proceed with the mission, Steelhammer. Secure the village, that's an order." "Sir, we've got an active chemical leak here. We need a hazmat team." "You have your orders, Captain. Secure the perimeter. Do not approach the substance. Wait for the follow-up forces." The transmission ended. Bill looked down at his crew, their faces distorted by gas masks, their eyes questioning. "Something's wrong," he told them. "This isn't a weapons cache. It's some kind of test." Before anyone could respond, movement caught his eye. American troops approaching from the south. A platoon of infantry moving in standard formation toward the village. "Command, Steelhammer! American forces approaching contaminated area. Request immediate halt." No response. "Command! Our troops are walking into a hot zone. Acknowledge." Silence. Bill made a decision that would haunt him for decades. "Rodriguez, move to intercept that platoon. Maximum speed. Martinez, pop smoke, create a barrier. Wilson, prepare for emergency extraction." The tank lurched forward, sprinting across the desert toward the approaching infantry. Bill stood in the hatch, waving at his arms, trying to signal them to stop. Too late, he saw masks being donned, orders being given. They'd been told to expect the smoke, to push through it. "No," he shouted, his voice lost in the roar of the turbine engine. "Fall back! Chemical leak!" The infantry entered the village perimeter. Some moved toward the leaking building, their training driving them to secure objectives despite danger. And then it began. One soldier stumbled, another fell to his knees, a third began convulsing. "Get us in there," Bill ordered. "We're evacuating casualties." Thunderbolt charged into the chaos, its bulk creating a barrier between the fallen soldiers and the spreading chemical agent. Bill dropped from the hatch, his boots hitting sand as he ran to the nearest fallen trooper. The young soldier's eyes were wide with panic behind his mask. Blood seeped from his nose, his ears. His body trembled uncontrollably. Bill lifted him, dragging him toward the tank where Wilson had emerged with a medical kit. "What the hell is this stuff?" Wilson demanded as he administered an atropine injector to the convulsing soldier. Not Iraqi, Bill realized, watching more soldiers fall. "This is one of ours. Has to be." They knew exactly what would happen. More tanks arrived, the rest of their platoon. Together they evacuated the affected infantry, loading them onto the back decks of their vehicles, anywhere they could secure a human body for transport. As Bill helped the last soldier, a sergeant whose skin had taken on a bluish tint, he looked back at the village. In the growing light of dawn, he could see the chemical agent clearly now, a colorless liquid that seemed to disappear into the sand, leaving no trace except the fallen bodies of American soldiers in its wake. Stone knew, he thought. He used us to test it, used them to see its effects. The knowledge settled in his soul like a penetrator round, burning through everything he'd believed about duty, honor, country. Bill jerked awake, sweat soaking his shirt despite the motel room's aggressive air conditioning. The dream, the memory, faded slowly, leaving him disoriented in the pre-dawn darkness. Across the room, Wilson sat in the chair by the window watching him. "Iron Shield?" the former gunner asked quietly. Bill nodded, rubbing his face with weathered hands. "Always the same dream. Always too late to stop it." "We didn't know," Wilson said, offering the absolution they'd repeated to each other for decades. "We couldn't have known what Stone was planning." "We should have," Bill countered, the familiar guilt resurfacing. The signs were there, the missing briefings, the vague objectives, Stone's insistence on radio silence during the operation. And if we had refused the mission, disobeyed orders in a war zone? It was an old argument, worn smooth by repetition. They both knew the answers. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, their warnings ignored, their credibility destroyed. And Stone's experiment would have proceeded anyway, with a different tank crew providing security. Bill swung his legs off the bed and checked his watch. 5:17 a.m. "Any word from Eleanor?" Wilson handed him a phone. Text came through at 4. "Stone's people are arriving at the museum at noon today. Official transfer of ownership documents for Thunderbolt and 6 other vehicles." "Damn," Bill muttered. "They're moving faster than we anticipated. Where's Martinez?" "Already headed to get the transport vehicles. He's calling in every favor his company still has credit for. Should be here by 10. "And Rodriguez?" "Securing the destination. His brother-in-law's farm is being prepared now. They're clearing the machine shop, setting up security." Bill nodded, impressed as always by his crew's efficiency. "Then we've got about 6 hours to get Thunderbolt ready for transport. Let's move." They arrived at the museum just as dawn was breaking, using Eleanor's key to enter through the service entrance. She was waiting for them in her office, her face drawn with worry. "They called an emergency board meeting for 11, she said without preamble. "Stone himself will be there. They're framing it as a generous government repurchase of select vehicles for enhanced preservation and display." "Generous?" Bill scoffed. "How much are they offering?" $1 per vehicle. Standard government repurchase policy for donated military equipment. "And the board will accept this?" Eleanor sighed. "They don't have a choice. The original donation agreements included a clause allowing the DoD to reclaim vehicles for national security purposes at any time." "Convenient," Wilson remarked dryly. "What about the break-in?" Bill asked, gesturing toward the modern-era gallery where Thunderbolt waited, her commander's hatch now conspicuously damaged. "I reported it as vandalism," Eleanor said, "but I don't think they believed me. There's been a security detail watching the building since midnight, 2 men in an unmarked sedan." Bill and Wilson exchanged glances. "Stone's not taking any chances," Wilson observed. "How are we supposed to move a 70-ton tank with federal agents watching the building?" Eleanor asked, the strain evident in her voice. "We don't," Bill replied. "We move a 30-ton hull and turret assembly using official museum transfer protocols, with all the proper paperwork." He pulled a folder from his backpack and handed it to Eleanor. Inside were transport manifests, equipment loan authorizations, and insurance certificates, all created by Martinez overnight using his company's legitimate business documentation. Battlefield Construction is officially contracted to transport Thunderbolt to Restoration Specialists LLC for a complete mechanical rebuild, Bill explained, all approved by the museum's director of collections. Eleanor stared at this paperwork, then at Bill. "That's me, the director of collections." "Convenient," Bill echoed Wilson's earlier comment. "The paperwork is backdated 2 weeks. Stone's team won't have time to verify it before the transport arrives. By the time they realize what's happened, Thunderbolt will be secured at a private facility. And when Stone comes after me for authorizing the transfer, you'll express shock and outrage at the obvious forgery of your signature," Wilson said smoothly. "You'll cooperate fully with the investigation while mourning the temporary loss of a historic artifact." Eleanor considered this, then nodded slowly. "It might work. If the transport team looks legitimate enough, the security detail might not interfere." "They'll look legitimate," Bill assured her. "Martinez's company has moved military equipment for years. His people know the protocols." "What do you need from me?" Eleanor asked, decision made. "Access to the loading dock, authorization to use the museum's equipment to prepare the tank, and your absence from the building from 10 o'clock onward. Plausible deniability." Eleanor checked her watch. "The board meeting is at 11. I'll need to be there." "Perfect," Bill said. "You'll be surrounded by witnesses when Thunderbolt disappears." With the plan set, they moved to the modern-era gallery. Thunderbolt waited in the semi-darkness, her battle scars and weathered paint telling a story few would ever fully understand. Bill approached her with mixed emotions: pride, guilt, determination. This machine had saved his life, had carried him through humanity's darkest moments, had kept his crew alive when so many others had fallen. And now, 3 decades later, she would serve one final mission: justice. "Let's get to work," he told Wilson. "We've got a tank to steal." The next 4 hours passed in a blur of focused activity. Using the museum's maintenance equipment, they disconnected Thunderbolt from her display mount, removed the non-functional replica components that had replaced her working parts, and prepared her for transport. Without her engine, transmission, and tracks, the tank was essentially a hulk, still massive but manageable with the right equipment. The museum's overhead crane, designed for precisely this kind of movement, made the process easier than it might have been. At precisely 9:55 a.m., Bill received a text from Martinez. "Transport 5 minutes out, dock clear." He surveyed the loading area. Everything was ready. Thunderbolt sat on a heavy-duty dolly, ready to be winched onto the transport vehicle. The necessary tools were arranged for quick loading. "Dock clear. Proceed," he replied. Eleanor appeared at the workshop door, her expression tense. "Stone's team just arrived. Early. They're inspecting the paperwork in my office." "How long can you stall them?" Bill asked, already moving to accelerate their timeline. 20 minutes. Maybe less. They're efficient. Then we work faster. Wilson, prep the crane. I'll open the dock doors." Eleanor hesitated. "What if they come to the gallery before you're gone?" Bill met her gaze steadily. "Then I'll do what I've always done. Complete the mission, regardless of opposition." She nodded, understanding the implication. "Good luck, Captain." As she left to delay Stone's team, Bill heard the rumble of diesel engines outside. The loading dock doors opened to reveal Martinez behind the wheel of a massive lowboy trailer, with Rodriguez riding shotgun. Behind them, a second identical transport waited, escorted by vehicles bearing the legitimate markings of battlefield construction. "Right on time," Bill said as Martinez approached. "Stone's people are here earlier than expected. We need to move fast." Martinez's face showed no surprise. The former scout had always thrived under pressure. "How fast?" 15 minutes or less. "We can do it in 10, Rodriguez asserted, already organizing the loading team. 4 burly construction workers who moved with the discipline of former military. With practiced efficiency, they secured cables to Thunderbolt's hull, operated the winch systems, and guided the tank onto the transport trailer. Each man knew his role, executing it with minimal communication, like the well-oiled crew they'd once been in the desert. Bill felt a surge of pride watching them work. Age had slowed their bodies, but not their minds, not their determination. They were still Steel Hammer, still the best damn tank crew that ever rolled through hell. 9 minutes after arrival, Thunderbolt was secured on the first transport vehicle. The loading equipment was stowed on the second. The paperwork was presented to the museum's receiving clerk, who stamped it without question. Another veteran, recognizing fellow soldiers on a mission. "We're green," Martinez called from the cab of the lead truck. "Mount up." Bill and Wilson climbed into the escort vehicle as the convoy prepared to depart. Through the rear window, Bill could see the museum's main entrance, where men in suits were now emerging, Eleanor gesturing animatedly as she apparently argued with them. "Stone's people," Wilson confirmed, following Bill's gaze. "They don't look happy." "They're about to be a lot less happy," Bill remarked as the convoy began to move. "Martinez, execute egress plan Alpha, maximum legal speed." The transports pulled away from the museum, turning onto the main road with the deliberate pace of heavy equipment operators who knew better than to attract attention. The escort vehicles positioned themselves fore and aft, their legitimate company markings and hazard lights warning other traffic of the oversized load. Bill watched in the side mirror as one of Stone's agents ran toward a sedan parked near the museum entrance. "We've been made. They'll be following us within 2 minutes." "Won't matter," Martinez replied through the radio. "We're splitting up at the next junction. Decoy transport heads east toward Cincinnati. We take Thunderbolt west, then south." It was a solid plan, the same principle as battlefield smoke deployment. Create confusion, mask the real target, exploit the enemy's uncertainty. As predicted, the black sedan appeared behind them as they approached the highway interchange. Without any obvious hurry, the convoy divided, the empty transport and one escort continuing east on I-64, while the Thunderbolt transport and the vehicle carrying Bill and his crew exited west, then turned south on a secondary highway. "They took the bait," Wilson reported, watching the sedan follow the decoy transport. "Amateurs. Stone's bureaucrats. Not field operatives, Bill noted. But he'll have better assets in place soon enough. We need to reach the farm before nightfall. The journey continued without incident for the next 2 hours, the transport maintaining a steady 55 miles per hour through the Kentucky countryside. Bill used the time to coordinate with Rodriguez's brother-in-law, confirming security arrangements at the farm and establishing protocols for their arrival. They were 20 miles from their destination when Wilson spotted it, a helicopter, maintaining distance but clearly tracking their movement. Military, he assessed, his gunner's eyes still sharp. Probably launched from Fort Campbell. Stone's calling in favors. Can they stop us? Rodriguez asked over the radio. Not without causing the scene, Bill replied. And Stone won't want that. Too many questions. They're just tracking us for now. And when we reach private property, Martinez pressed. Then it gets complicated, Bill admitted. Legally, they'd need a warrant. Practically, he didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the reality. Men like Stone operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal, between official authority and unofficial power. We faced worse odds, Wilson reminded them. Remember the Republican Guards' counterattack at Phase Line Bullet? 3 platoons against our single tank? The memory brought grim smiles to all their faces. They'd been outgunned, outmanned, and yet they'd prevailed through superior tactics and sheer determination. Same principles apply, Bill decided. We use terrain, we use deception, and we use the enemy's expectations against them. He outlined a modified plan as they approached their destination. Instead of taking the direct route to the farm, they would execute a series of turns through the back roads of rural Kentucky. Roads too narrow for any vehicle to pass them, too winding for the helicopter to anticipate their movements. For the next hour, they led their aerial shadow on a merry chase, zigging when expected to zag, doubling back, using tree cover when available. The heavy transport negotiated country lanes never intended for such traffic, Martinez's skilled driving keeping them moving despite the challenges. As dusk approached, they made their final approach to the farm, a sprawling property nestled against the foothills of the Appalachians. The main entrance was blocked by a legitimate logging operation, forcing any ground pursuit to take a lengthy detour. The transport rumbled across a reinforced bridge, spanning a small river, then through heavy woods that masked them from aerial observation. By the time they reached the central compound, the helicopter had lost their position, circling miles to the north where the property's official address was located. Rodriguez's brother-in-law, a barrel-chested former Marine named Frank Delgado, waited for them at the machine shop, a massive steel building that had once serviced combine harvesters and now would house their stolen tank. Welcome to Fort Delgado, he greeted them as they climbed down from the vehicles. Secure facility, off-grid power, no electronic signatures, just like we planned in Desert Shield. Frank had served with Rodriguez in the Marines before both had transferred to the Army. His handshake was crushing, his smile genuine beneath a salt and pepper mustache. Stone's people will find us eventually, Bill warned as they directed the unloading of Thunderbolt into the machine shop. How long can you hold them off legally? This is Kentucky, Captain, Frank replied with a grin. Private property rights are practically sacred. They'd need a federal warrant, and my cousin's the county judge. Could take days to process. Weeks if we get creative with jurisdictional challenges. It was exactly what they needed. Time. Time to document the evidence properly. Time to formulate their strategy for going public. Time to restore Thunderbolt as a symbol that could rally public opinion. As night fell, Thunderbolt rested inside the cavernous machine shop, surrounded by tools and equipment that would help bring her back to life. Bill stood before her, placing a hand on her battle-scarred armor. One last mission, old girl, he murmured. One last fight for the truth. Behind him, his crew and their allies prepared for the work ahead. Wilson digitized documents from the evidence container. Martinez established secure communications and monitored official channels for any mention of the theft. Rodriguez inventoried tools and parts, already formulating a restoration plan. They were old men now, far from the young warriors who had once charged across the desert in history's last great tank battle. But the steel that had defined them then, the resolve, the brotherhood, the determination, remained unrusted by time. The battle for Thunderbolt's future, and for justice long denied, had only just begun. And like every mission they'd faced together, failure was not an option. Chapter 5. The First Challenge. The morning after their audacious heist, Bill stood in the machine shop doorway, watching the sunrise paint Kentucky's rolling hills in shades of gold and amber. Behind him, Thunderbolt rested in the center of the spacious building, surrounded by tools and equipment hastily gathered for her restoration. He sipped strong black coffee from a chipped mug, allowing himself a moment of reflection before the day's challenges began. They had pulled off something remarkable yesterday, stealing a national treasure from under the nose of one of Washington's most powerful men. But that was merely the opening salvo in what would surely become a protracted campaign. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Wilson joined him at the doorway, his medical bag slung over one shoulder. "Perimeter checks out," the former gunner reported. "Frank's men are patrolling the property borders. No sign of surveillance yet." "They'll come," Bill said with certainty. "Stone's not a man who accepts defeat." Wilson nodded in agreement. "How long do you think we have?" 48 hours, maybe less. Stone will need to mobilize federal resources without revealing his true motives. That takes time, even for someone at his level. "Then we better make those hours count." They returned inside where Rodriguez was already working, his methodical mind breaking down the mammoth restoration task into manageable components. "We need to prioritize," Rodriguez explained, spreading a hand-drawn diagram across a workbench. "Thunderbolt doesn't need to actually fire her main gun or move under her own power. She just needs to look complete and authentic for the fundraising campaign." "Cosmetic restoration first," Bill agreed. "Get her looking battle-ready for photographs and video." Martinez entered from the farmhouse, laptop under his arm. "I've got news, good and bad." They gathered around as he set up his computer. "The good news is our tank theft is still flying under the radar. No news reports, no APBs, no alerts on official channels." "And the bad?" Bill prompted. "Stone's moving fast on the museum closure. Board approved the repurchase of 7 vehicles yesterday. They're being transported to a military depot in Ohio as we speak." "Leaving how many at the museum?" Wilson asked. "About 30 vehicles, but without the marquee attractions, attendance will plummet. Eleanor estimates they'll be forced to close within 6 months." "Then we have a deadline," Bill concluded. 6 months to restore Thunderbolt, raise $1 million, and expose Stone's war crimes, all while evading federal authorities. The enormity of the challenge hung in the air between them. In the desert, they'd had the advantage of superior equipment, training, and firepower. Here, they were outgunned in every way that mattered. "One target at a time," Rodriguez reminded them, echoing Bill's mantra from the previous day. "First target, get Thunderbolt presentation ready." They divided responsibilities according to their strengths. Rodriguez would lead the technical restoration work, focusing on the external components that would make Thunderbolt look operational. Martinez would develop the fundraising and publicity campaign, creating the digital infrastructure needed to tell their story. Wilson would organize the evidence from Iron Shield, preparing it for eventual public disclosure. And Bill would coordinate their overall strategy, drawing on his command experience to anticipate Stone's countermoves. The work began immediately. Using the farm's equipment and Rodriguez's technical expertise, they carefully cleaned decades of museum dust from Thunderbolt's exterior. The original desert tan paint had faded unevenly, requiring careful restoration to maintain its authentic appearance. "We should leave some of the battle damage," Bill suggested as Rodriguez prepared to repair a gouge in the turret armor, the scar left by an Iraqi 125mm round that had struck at an oblique angle during their advance. "It tells her story." Rodriguez nodded in understanding. "The museum repaired the worst of it back in '91. What's left is just enough to show she saw combat without looking like she lost." By midday, they had established a rhythm to their work, falling back into the patterns of cooperation that had once made them an elite tank crew. Frank provided additional hands when needed, along with a steady stream of food and coffee from the farmhouse. Around noon, Martinez called them together for a strategic update. "I've been monitoring chatter on various channels," he explained, showing them his laptop screen. "Stone's keeping this quiet, but he's mobilizing resources. FAA has implemented temporary flight restrictions over the museum and surrounding area, supposedly for a training exercise. And there's unusual activity at Fort Knox, personnel movements, vehicle requisitions. Setting up a search grid," Bill assessed. "Standard protocol for recovering sensitive equipment." "They know we're within a day's drive of the museum," Wilson added. "That's a lot of territory to cover." "They'll focus on locations with the infrastructure to handle a tank," Bill predicted. "Farms, warehouses, industrial facilities. They'll check known associates first, then expand outward." "How long before they connect Rodriguez to Frank?" Martinez asked. "Personnel records would show they served together," Bill calculated. "But making the leap to this specific farm, That depends on how thoroughly they investigate. Days, maybe a week. Then we accelerate the public campaign, Martinez decided. The more eyes on this story, the harder it will be for Stone to move against us quietly. He showed them the preliminary website he'd created. Operation Thunderbolt, the last tank standing. The site featured historical photos of the tank in Desert Storm, information about the museum's financial plight, and an initial fundraising goal of $250,000, enough to secure a Thunderbolt's future without revealing their ultimate objective. We launch tomorrow, Martinez explained. I've already reached out to veterans groups, military history forums, and social media influencers in the preservation community. Once we have Thunderbolt looking presentable, we'll release a video explaining the mission. And Stone, Wilson questioned, he'll see this instantly. Counting on it, Martinez replied with a predatory smile. The more public attention on Thunderbolt, the more difficult it becomes for him to seize her without explanation. We're building a protective shield of public opinion. Classic insurgency technique, Bill noted approvingly. Use the enemy's strengths against them. Stone's authority gives him power, but it also constrains his actions. He can't be seen attacking veterans trying to save military history. As they returned to work, the sound of rotor blades caught their attention. A helicopter passed overhead, civilian markings, but flying a search pattern. Stone's people, Martinez confirmed, checking a tracking application on his phone. They're working a grid pattern centered on the museum. This section of the county wasn't their first priority. But they got here faster than expected, Bill noted with concern. Frank, how visible is Thunderbolt from the air? Building's roof is solid, Frank assured him. No skylights, no windows large enough to see inside. Heat signature would be masked by the shop equipment. We look like any other agricultural operation. Bill wasn't entirely convinced. Move Thunderbolt to the north side of the building, away from the main doors. Cover her with tarps. And let's limit activity outside. No obvious security patrols. Nothing that would differentiate this farm from others in the area. They worked through the afternoon, the helicopter making 2 more passes over the property before moving on to adjacent areas. By nightfall, Thunderbolt had been repositioned and disguised, her exterior cleaning completed. Rodriguez had even managed to repair some of the museum modifications, removing welds that had sealed access hatches and restoring the commander's position to something approaching its original configuration. As they gathered for dinner in the farmhouse, fatigue etched in every line of their aging faces, Bill found himself studying his crew. Wilson moved more slowly than the others, his medical condition clearly taking a toll despite his determination to hide it. Martinez's hands showed a slight tremor, stress, exhaustion, or both. Rodriguez alone seemed energized by the technical challenge, his engineer's mind fully engaged in solving the puzzle of Thunderbolt's restoration. We need help, Bill acknowledged, breaking a silence that had stretched through the meal. The 4 of us can't do this alone, not in the time frame we have. What kind of help are you thinking? Martinez asked. Technical expertise for the restoration, security professionals to counter Stone's resources, media contacts to amplify our message. Adding people increases risk, Wilson cautioned. Each new person is a potential security breach. Calculated risk, Bill countered. We need a network, not just a crew. Rodriguez set down his fork. I know some people, former tankers working in various industries now, men and women who understand what we're doing and why it matters. Can they be vetted? Bill asked. We can't afford infiltration. They can be trusted, Rodriguez assured him. Desert Storm veterans mostly, some Iraq and Afghanistan, people who've seen what happens when the government decides soldiers are expendable. Bill considered this. Make the calls, but carefully. Secure communications only, and they need to understand that this is potentially illegal. Theft of government property, misappropriation of military equipment. They'll understand, Rodriguez said with quiet certainty. Some of them are sick themselves. Gulf War syndrome, post-deployment health issues the VA still won't acknowledge. They've been waiting 30 years for someone to stand up. The conversation shifted to their immediate needs. Parts for Thunderbolt's external restoration, secure communications equipment, surveillance countermeasures. Frank offered his extensive network of former Marines, many of whom had transitioned into industries that could provide the resources they needed. As the discussion continued, Bill slipped outside, needing a moment alone with his thoughts. The night air carried the scent of hay and distant rain, so different from the petroleum and cordite that had once defined his world. He gazed up at stars partially obscured by gathering clouds, the same stars that had guided them across the featureless desert 3 decades ago. Somewhere out there, Stone was mobilizing against them, a different kind of war, but with similar stakes. Wilson joined him on the porch, the creak of the screen door announcing his presence. "Second thoughts, Captain?" he asked quietly. Bill shook his head. "Tactical assessment. Stone has resources, authority, and the element of surprise. We have a stolen tank, limited manpower, and evidence that's 30 years old." "Sounds like the odds were in Desert Storm," Wilson observed. "Except we were Stone and the Iraqis were us." The parallel hung between them, uncomfortable in its accuracy. "The difference," Bill finally said, "is that we have something Stone doesn't." "What's that?" "The truth," Bill replied simply. "And in America, that still counts for something. At least, I have to believe it does." Wilson nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. After a lifetime in medicine, he'd seen too many powerful interests bury inconvenient truths beneath bureaucracy and denial. "There's something else you should know," Wilson said after a moment. "I've been in touch with some of my former patients, veterans with Gulf War syndrome symptoms. Word is spreading through the community about unexplained illnesses linked to specific operations during Desert Storm. Iron Shield? Among others, there were multiple test sites, Bill, multiple exposures, thousands of affected soldiers." The revelation shouldn't have surprised him, yet Bill felt the familiar cold weight of betrayal settling in his chest. "How many, Doc?" "Based on my analysis of VA records and private medical reports, at least 250,000 veterans exposed to some degree, maybe 50,000 with serious life-altering symptoms, and approximately 30,000 premature deaths that could be attributed to chemical exposure." "Jesus Christ," Bill whispered, the scale of the crime overwhelming him. "And they've covered it up all this time. Let men and women suffer and die rather than admit what they did." "It's bigger than Stone," Wilson confirmed. "He was a colonel then, ambitious but not powerful enough to orchestrate a cover-up of this magnitude. He had help, lots of it, people who still hold positions of influence today." The implications were staggering. What had begun as a mission to save a museum and expose one man's war crimes was expanding into something far larger. A conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military and government leadership. "This changes things," Bill acknowledged. "We're not just fighting for Thunderbolt anymore, or even for justice for what happened during Iron Shield. We're fighting for every veteran who came home sick and was told they were imagining it. For every family that lost someone to a mystery illness the government refused to acknowledge." Wilson's expression was grim, but resolute. "That's why I saved the evidence, Captain. That's why I welded that box into Thunderbolt's hull. I knew someday we'd need to tell the truth. I just didn't think it would take 30 years. Better late than never, Doc." They returned inside to find Martinez and Rodriguez deep in conversation about the website launch scheduled for the following day. "We need something dramatic," Martinez was saying. "Something that will grab attention immediately." Bill's mind, still processing Wilson's revelations, shifted to tactical planning. "We need to control the narrative from the start. Get ahead of Stone and his people." "What are you thinking?" Rodriguez asked. "A video message, direct from the four of us, with Thunderbolt as backdrop. We tell our story, not the classified details, not yet, but enough to make it clear why this matters." "A manifesto?" Martinez questioned, skeptical. "A mission statement," Bill corrected. "We're not radicals or criminals. We're veterans protecting our heritage and seeking truth. We frame this as an act of patriotism, not defiance." The idea resonated with all of them. Using Frank's equipment and Martinez's media expertise, they spent the next hours planning the video's content, setting up lighting in the machine shop, and preparing Thunderbolt as the centerpiece of their message. By midnight, they were ready to film. Thunderbolt gleamed under the shop lights, her desert tan paint restored to its wartime luster, her silhouette unmistakable to anyone who had served in armor units. The four men stood before her, dressed not in their old uniforms, but in the civilian clothes that represented who they had become. Wilson in a doctor's button-down shirt and tie, Martinez in business casual, Rodriguez in mechanic's coveralls, and Bill in the simple flannel and jeans of a retired soldier. Martinez set the camera on a tripod and joined the others. "Whenever you're ready, Captain." Bill faced the camera, drawing on the command presence that had once directed men through the fog of war. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority and the conviction of truth. "My name is Captain William Harrington, United States Army, retired. Behind me is Thunderbolt, an M1A1 Abrams tank that carried my crew and me through Operation Desert Storm. She was more than a machine to us. She was our protector, our home, and ultimately, the keeper of secrets that powerful men have worked for 30 years to conceal. He gestured to the men beside him. This is my crew, Dr. Marcus Wilson, Thomas Martinez, and Carlos Rodriguez. Together, we fought for our country when called. Today, we're fighting for something just as important: the truth about what happened to thousands of American soldiers during and after Desert Storm. Bill explained the museum's plight, the threat to Thunderbolt's preservation, and their decision to temporarily secure the tank to prevent its sale to private interests. We've launched Operation Thunderbolt to raise awareness and funds to ensure that this piece of American history and the truth it contains remains accessible to the public. We're not seeking personal gain. Every dollar raised will go directly to preserving Thunderbolt and supporting the National Armor Museum. He leaned slightly forward, his expression intensifying. To those in power who might wish to silence us, we are not your enemies. We are not traitors or thieves. We are American soldiers who believe that truth and accountability are not negotiable values. They are the foundation of the democracy we swore to defend. Bill straightened, his gaze unwavering. To our fellow veterans, especially those who have suffered unexplained illnesses since serving in the Gulf, we see you, we hear you, and we will not rest until your sacrifices are acknowledged and honored. He concluded with the call to action that Martinez had crafted. Join Operation Thunderbolt. Help us save not just a tank, but the truth it protects. Because some battles don't end when the shooting stops. Some must be fought with courage and conviction for decades to come. The camera continued recording as Bill stepped back, allowing each crew member to speak briefly about their personal connection to Thunderbolt and their commitment to the mission. When they finished, a silence fell over the machine shop, broken only by the soft pinging of cooling metal as Thunderbolt settled around them. That'll do it, Martinez said finally, stopping the recording. I'll edit it tonight, have it ready for tomorrow's launch. As they dispersed to their assigned sleeping quarters in the farmhouse, Bill remained behind, standing in the commander's position atop Thunderbolt's turret. The familiarity of the position brought a flood of memories, some honorable, others haunting. From this position, he had directed fire that destroyed enemy tanks and saved American lives. From this position, he had watched young soldiers fall to an invisible enemy deployed by their own command. From this position, he had made the decision to stay silent for 30 years, to prioritize his career and his crew's safety over the truth. No more, he whispered to the silent machine beneath him. No more hiding, no more silence. In the darkness of the Kentucky night, surrounded by the ghosts of decisions past and the weight of the fight to come, Captain William Harrington made his final peace with the choices that had defined his life. Whatever came next, victory or defeat, vindication or disgrace, he would face it with the same resolve that had carried him through the desert's fire. The battle for Thunderbolt's legacy, and for justice too long denied, had begun. And like the tank herself, Bill Harrington would not retreat, would not surrender, would not fail in this final mission. The thunder of approaching storms echoed across the hills, nature's artillery heralding the conflict to come. Dawn broke over the Kentucky hills, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold. Inside the cavernous machine shop, Captain William "Iron Bill" Harrington stood before Thunderbolt, assessing the progress they had made in the 3 days since their audacious heist. The tank's exterior gleamed under the workshop lights, her desert tan paint restored to its wartime glory. But appearances were deceiving. How bad is it? Bill asked as Rodriguez emerged from the inspection hatch, grease staining his weathered hands. Rodriguez wiped his brow, leaving a dark smudge across his forehead. Worse than we thought, Captain. The turret traverse system is completely seized. The elevation gears for the main gun are corroded beyond salvation, and the fire control computer. He shook his head. Museum removed it entirely, probably in storage somewhere if it wasn't scrapped. Bill circled the tank, his hand trailing along the cool metal of her flank. 30 years in climate-controlled display had preserved her exterior, but the mechanical systems within had deteriorated from disuse and improper preservation. What about the engine compartment? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Empty, Rodriguez confirmed. They pulled the AGT-1500 turbine when she was decommissioned. Probably went to the parts reclamation program. Martinez looked up from his laptop where he was monitoring the initial response to their video release. So we're talking about a complete internal restoration? Is that even possible? Rodriguez's expression shifted from grim determination to something like excitement. The challenge before them was igniting the engineer's passion. Possible? Yes. Easy? Hell no. He spread out a schematic on a nearby workbench. We need to source replacement parts for systems that haven't been manufactured in decades. We need specialized tools, technical expertise beyond what even I have. And money, Wilson added from where he sat resting, his medical condition sapping his energy more quickly these days. Lots of it. Martinez offered a thin smile. That part might be working itself out. He turned his laptop around to show them the Operation Thunderbolt website. A donation counter steadily clicked upward, already approaching $30,000 after just 18 hours online. Veterans groups are rallying, he explained. The video struck a nerve. We've got former tankers from 3 generations pledging support. Vietnam guys, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They're sharing it across every platform. Bill studied the screen, noting the comments flooding in beneath their video. Messages of support, offers of assistance, personal stories of similar experiences. The community they'd hoped to mobilize was responding even more strongly than anticipated. Any pushback? He asked, ever the tactician assessing battlefield conditions. Martinez nodded. Department of Defense issued a statement about unauthorized removal of government property without naming us specifically. A few trolls claiming we're attention-seeking or conspiracy theorists, but they're being drowned out by supporters. And Stone? Bill pressed. Silent so far. No official comment. Bill understood the strategy. Stone was too experienced to engage directly at this stage. He would be building his case methodically, identifying their weaknesses, preparing a response that would discredit them without revealing his own vulnerability. He'll move soon, Bill predicted. We need to accelerate our timeline. He turned to Rodriguez. What's our first priority for the restoration? Rodriguez considered the question with the careful analysis of a man who had spent decades perfecting complex machinery. Getting the turret operational, he decided, even without an engine, if we can demonstrate the turret traversing and the gun elevating, it creates a powerful visual. Shows Thunderbolt coming back to life. What do you need? Electric motors to replace the hydraulic systems, a power supply that can handle the load, and someone who knows the fire control software well enough to recreate a simplified version. Bill nodded. Martinez put out specific calls for those components through secure channels. Wilson, how's the evidence processing coming? Wilson gestured to the folding table where he'd established his workstation. Documents were carefully arranged in protective sleeves, photos organized chronologically, and digital backups stored on encrypted drives. I've cataloged everything, he reported. Created a database linking each piece of evidence to specific violations of military protocol and international law. The soil samples, he hesitated. They need professional analysis. I've reached out to a colleague at Johns Hopkins who specializes in chemical weapons exposure. Someone I trust. Can they be trusted with this? Bill questioned, his instinct for operational security still sharp after all these years. Wilson met his gaze. She lost her husband to Gulf War syndrome in 2005, spent 15 years trying to get the VA to acknowledge the connection. She'll be discreet. Bill accepted the assessment with a nod. Wilson's judgment of character had always been reliable, one of many reasons he'd been an exceptional gunner. The ability to identify friend from foe in split-second decisions had saved their lives more than once. Their planning session was interrupted by Frank's arrival. The former Marine's expression was tense as he entered the workshop. We've got movement on the perimeter, he reported. Unmarked vehicle parked on the county road a mile out. 2 men with binoculars watching the property. Stone's people, Bill concluded, faster than expected. They have an approach, Frank continued, just observing for now. Bill processed this development, mentally adjusting their tactical posture. They're confirming our location before committing resources. Standard reconnaissance. What's our play? Martinez asked. We don't engage, Bill decided. We continue operations as if unaware, but accelerate everything. Rodriguez, what's your timeline for getting the turret operational? With the right parts and assistance? 3 days minimum. You have 2, Bill told him. Martinez, how soon can we stage a demonstration for the cameras? Show our supporters some tangible progress? Video team arrives tomorrow. Former combat photographers from the 55th Signal Company. They'll handle it professionally, maintain operational security. Bill turned to Wilson. Doc, I need you to prepare a condensed version of the evidence. Something we can release as an insurance policy if Stone moves against us. Not everything, just enough to establish the pattern and implicate him directly. Wilson nodded, though concern flickered across his face. That's our nuclear option, Bill. Once we release any portion of this, there's no going back. I know, Bill acknowledged, but we need to be ready. Stone won't play by the rules we expect. As if summoned by his words, Martinez's phone chimed with an alert. His expression darkened as he read the notification. Channel 9 News just ran a story, he reported. Retired Army Captain William Harrington and 3 accomplices wanted for questioning in the theft of historical military equipment. They're calling it a senior citizen heist, painting us as confused veterans with delusions of government conspiracies. They're trying to discredit us, Wilson realized, make us look senile or unstable. Standard counterinsurgency tactic, Bill noted, his tactical mind assessing the attack. Undermine the messenger when you can't refute the message. He paced the length of Thunderbolt, his reflection distorted in her newly polished armor. This changes our approach. We need to establish credibility quickly. How? Rodriguez asked. By bringing in respected voices who can validate our claims, former officers, military historians, medical experts on Gulf War syndrome. Martinez was already typing notes. I know a retired brigadier general who's been advocating for better veteran care. He might be willing to review our evidence, make a statement. And I have contacts at the VA Medical Center in Cincinnati, Wilson added. Doctors who've been fighting the official denials for years. They can speak to the pattern of illness. Bill nodded approval. Good, reach out but carefully. Anyone who associates with us will become a target for Stone's people. The day progressed in a flurry of activity, while Rodriguez and a small team of trusted mechanics began the painstaking work of restoring Thunderbolt's turret systems. Martinez coordinated their expanding media campaign. Wilson continued processing the Iron Shield evidence, preparing both for public disclosure and potential legal proceedings. Bill moved between those efforts, directing, advising, and occasionally stepping in with hands-on assistance. The command skills that had once guided tank formations through battlefield chaos now applied to this different kind of warfare. Information battles fought with documents and digital media rather than sabot rounds and coaxial machine guns. By late afternoon, the surveillance vehicle Frank had spotted was joined by a second, both maintaining their distance but clearly monitoring the farm. Bill watched them through binoculars from an upstairs window in the farmhouse, recognizing the disciplined patience of professional observers. Federal marshals most likely, he assessed when Frank joined him. Stone's keeping local law enforcement out of it for now, trying to handle this quietly. How long before they make a move? Frank asked. They'll wait for authorization and reinforcements. Stone will want overwhelming force to ensure there's no resistance. My property, my rights, Frank reminded him. They need a warrant. Bill lowered the binoculars. Stone won't concern himself with legal niceties when national security is his pretext. We should assume we have 24 hours maximum before they attempt to seize Thunderbolt and arrest us. Frank's jaw tightened beneath his salt and pepper beard. Then we'd better be ready. The former Marine outlined the defensive measures he'd implemented. Nothing illegal, nothing that would justify a tactical response, but enough to provide early warning and delay any attempt to access the property without proper authorization. Bill approved the preparations, though privately he harbored no illusions about their ability to resist if Stone deployed serious assets. This wasn't a hill to die on. It was merely a position to hold long enough to accomplish their mission of exposure and accountability. As night fell, the team gathered in the machine shop for a situation update. Rodriguez reported progress on the turret restoration, though part shortages remained a critical issue. Martinez shared encouraging news about their fundraising efforts, which had surpassed $100,000 and showed no signs of slowing. Wilson's update was more concerning. I've been monitoring VA data networks through my medical access credentials, he explained, his physician's face grave. There's been unusual activity in the records of Gulf War veterans, files being accessed, modified, or restricted, particularly those with documented exposure symptoms matching what we saw at Al-Bahar. Stone's covering his tracks, Bill concluded, sanitizing the evidence before we can correlate it with our documentation. Not just Stone, Wilson corrected. This is happening at a level that requires multiple department authorizations. Pentagon, VA, CDC. There's a coordinated effort to eliminate the paper trail. The revelation confirmed Bill's suspicion that they were facing something larger than one man's crimes. Stone was merely the visible face of a systemic cover-up that had persisted across multiple administrations, protected by the shield of national security and bureaucratic inertia. All the more reason to move quickly, Bill decided. Tomorrow we demonstrate Thunderbolt's restoration progress on camera. We release the first portion of our evidence documenting Iron Shield, and we name names starting with Stone. Wilson looked troubled. That's a major escalation, Captain. Stone will respond with everything he has. Counting on it, Bill replied. Sometimes you have to draw enemy fire to reveal their positions. The meeting concluded with detailed assignments for the coming day, what Martinez called D-Day for disclosure. Each man returned to his task with renewed urgency, aware that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Bill remained with Thunderbolt after the others departed, climbing carefully into the commander's position through the hatch he had forcibly opened in the museum days earlier. The seat was familiar despite the decades that had passed. The curves and contours designed to cradle a tank commander through the violent motions of cross-country movement and combat maneuvering. He ran his hands over the periscopes, the radio mounts, the controls that had once extended his will across the battlefield, all dormant now, like the memories they evoked. One more battle, old girl, he murmured to the silent machine. One more charge. In the quiet of the Kentucky night, surrounded by the ghosts of wars past, in the looming shadow of conflicts to come, Captain William Harrington prepared for what might be his final command decision. Not on a distant battlefield against a foreign enemy, but on American soil against forces that had betrayed the very principles they had all sworn to defend. The irony was not lost on him. After a lifetime of service, his last act of duty might be labeled treason by those who had abandoned their own sacred obligations. But duty, honor, country, these weren't just words to men like Bill Harrington. They were a covenant, a promise that transcended ranks and regulations when fundamental truths were at stake. Tomorrow would tell whether America still honored such promises or whether they had become merely convenient fictions to be discarded when inconvenient. Either way, Bill and his crew would stand with Thunderbolt, as they always had, facing whatever came with the steady resolve of men who had already confronted death and found it less frightening than dishonor. Chapter 6. Financial Crisis and Personal Battles. The morning arrived with a sense of inevitable confrontation hanging in the air. Bill stood outside the workshop, coffee mug in hand, watching as Rodriguez's team continued their round-the-clock work on Thunderbolt's resurrection. The surveillance vehicles remained in position on the distant county road, now joined by a third. Martinez approached, his business attire incongruous among the coveralls and work clothes that dominated the farm. Our media team is 15 minutes out, he reported. 4-person crew, all vetted, all with military backgrounds. And our financial situation? Bill asked, knowing that their mission, like any military operation, depended on adequate resourcing. Martinez's expression tightened. Complicated. We've raised nearly $200,000 now through direct donations. Impressive for 3 days, but my company's creditors have somehow discovered my involvement. They're accelerating collection procedures, freezing business assets that I was planning to liquidate for this operation. Stone's financial pressure, Bill assessed, cutting off our resources. It gets worse. My personal accounts are being audited by the IRS. Convenient timing. Bill placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, feeling the tension beneath the crisp dress shirt. We knew there would be consequences, Thomas. Martinez nodded, his jaw set with determination. Worth it, but you should know, I'm officially broke as of this morning. Everything I have left is in Thunderbolt. The admission was delivered matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but Bill understood the magnitude of the sacrifice. Martinez had built his construction business from nothing after leaving the Army, turning his tactical planning skills into entrepreneurial success. Now it was being stripped away as punishment for standing with his former commander. We'll make it right, Bill promised. When the truth comes out, don't, Martinez interrupted, his expression softening. I'm not looking for guarantees, Captain. Some missions don't come with extraction plans, we all know that. Before Bill could respond, Wilson emerged from the farmhouse, his medical bag clutched in one hand, his other steadying himself against the porch railing. His complexion had taken on a grayish pallor overnight, the pain of his advancing cancer evident in the tightness around his eyes. Morning briefing? Wilson asked, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. Doc, you should be resting, Bill said, concerned by his gunner's deteriorating condition. Wilson shook his head. Rest is for missions accomplished, Captain. We're still in the field. The three men made their way to the improvised command center they'd established in a corner of the workshop. Rodriguez joined them, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag. "Status reports," Bill directed, falling into the familiar rhythm of command. Rodriguez went first. "Turret traverse system is partially operational. We've replaced the hydraulics with electric motors scrounged from agricultural equipment. Not elegant, but functional. Gun elevation mechanism needs another day, maybe two. The real challenge is the fire control system. We need specialized parts that aren't commercially available." "Options?" Bill prompted. "I've reached out to some former Abrams maintenance technicians through secure channels. They might be able to source components through unofficial means." Rodriguez hesitated. "But it's risky. Could alert Stone's people to our technical requirements." "Calculated risk," Bill decided. "Proceed, but with extreme caution. What's our operational timeline looking like?" 72 hours for basic demonstration capability. 2 weeks for something approaching authentic functionality. A month to make her look and operate close to original specifications, minus the engine and main gun firing capability. Bill turned to Wilson. "Evidence processing?" The doctor straightened in his chair, professional discipline momentarily overriding physical discomfort. "Digitization complete. 3 secure copies distributed to trusted repositories. I've prepared an executive summary documenting Stone's direct involvement in Iron Shield, with supporting evidence that can't be dismissed as fabrication or misinterpretation. And your medical colleague, the chemical weapons expert, arrives tomorrow. She'll bring equipment to analyze the soil samples properly." Bill nodded approval, then addressed Martinez. "Media strategy?" "Today's demonstration will focus on the restoration progress. Human interest angle, veterans saving their historic tank. We don't mention Iron Shield or chemical weapons yet. That's phase 2, after we've established credibility and public support. And our supporters?" Martinez allowed himself a small smile. "Growing exponentially. Veterans organizations across the country are rallying behind us. Military history enthusiasts, tank restoration communities, Gulf War veterans advocacy groups, they're all spreading our message. The hashtag a Thunderbolt Rising is trending on multiple platforms." "Stone's countermeasures?" Bill asked, returning to the threats they faced. Martinez's smile faded. "Sophisticated disinformation campaign underway. Stories questioning our mental stability, our motives, our historical claims, financial pressure, as I mentioned. And there's movement in the legal system, federal warrants being prepared, according to my contact at the Justice Department. Timeline? 24 to 48 hours before they move against us directly." Bill absorbed this intelligence, mentally calculating force dispositions and response options, as he had countless times in combat situations. The battlefield was different, but the principles remained constant. Identify threats, secure objectives, maintain freedom of maneuver. "We proceed as planned," he decided. "Today's media event goes forward. We demonstrate Thunderbolt's restoration progress, emphasize the historical preservation angle. Rodriguez, ensure the turret can rotate for the cameras, even if it's just a limited demonstration." "We'll be ready, Captain." Wilson, prepare the first evidence package for release tomorrow, focused specifically on Stone's role in authorizing the chemical weapons deployment. Nothing classified that could justify charges against us, but enough to establish the pattern of decision and cover-up. Wilson nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "And if Stone moves against us before then we accelerate to full disclosure," Bill stated firmly. "Everything goes public immediately. The complete Iron Shield documentation, all evidence of the subsequent cover-up, and the names of everyone involved at every level." The gravity of this contingency hung in the air between them. Full disclosure would not only expose Stone, but would implicate dozens of officials across multiple agencies and administrations. It would challenge fundamental narratives about American conduct during Desert Storm and subsequent conflicts. The consequences would be profound and unpredictable. "Mutually assured destruction," Rodriguez observed quietly. "Precisely," Bill confirmed. "Stone knows we have this option. He'll factor it into his calculations. It may buy us the time we need." The meeting concluded as Frank arrived to announce the media team's arrival. The farm became a hive of activity as cameras were set up, lighting positioned, and Thunderbolt prepared for her public reintroduction. Bill watched the proceedings with the detached assessment of a commander observing battlefield preparations. Their plan was solid, their positions secured, their objectives clear. Yet experience had taught him that no plans survive contact with the enemy intact. Adaptability would determine success or failure in the coming hours. The media demonstration exceeded even Martinez's expectations. Thunderbolt's turret rotated smoothly under Rodriguez's direction, drawing appreciative murmurs from the assembled camera crew. The tank commander's position, Bill's former post, had been meticulously restored, complete with functioning periscopes and communication equipment. The four former crew members posed for photographs beside their resurrected steel companion, each man's face reflecting both pride in their accomplishment and awareness of the cost still to be paid. The interviews that followed struck the careful balance Martinez had outlined, focusing on the historical significance of the Abrams in American military heritage, while hinting at deeper stories yet to be told. "This is more than just a tank," Bill explained to the lead interviewer, a former combat correspondent who understood the unspoken language of soldiers. "Thunderbolt carried us through humanity's darkest moments. She protected us when nothing else could, and she preserved truths that need to finally see the light of day." "What kinds of truths, Captain Harrington?" the reporter probed, sensing the story beneath the story. Bill met his gaze steadily. "The kind that powerful people have worked for 3 decades to conceal. The kind that might explain why thousands of Gulf War veterans came home with unexplained illnesses that the government still refuses to fully acknowledge." The reporter's eyebrows rose. "Are you suggesting there's evidence inside this tank related to Gulf War syndrome?" "I'm suggesting that Thunderbolt's story and ours doesn't end with the battlefield victories recorded in the history books." Bill rested his hand on the tank's hull, the connection palpable. "Tomorrow we'll begin sharing documents that fill in those missing chapters. Documents that certain officials at the highest levels of government never expected to see the light of day." The interview concluded, but Bill's measured revelation had achieved precisely what Martinez had intended, creating anticipation for their next disclosure while establishing the seriousness of their claims. This wasn't a stunt or a heist. It was veterans fulfilling their oath to defend the Constitution against enemies foreign and domestic. As the media team departed with promises to broadcast the segment that evening, Bill noticed Wilson sitting alone near the workshop entrance, his breathing labored, his complexion alarmingly pale. "Doc?" Bill approached, concern overriding command protocol. "What's wrong?" Wilson attempted a reassuring smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Nothing unexpected, Captain. Cancer's just reminding me who's in charge of the timetable." Bill crouched beside his longtime friend, the man who had served as his gunner through the most intense combat of their lives. "We need to get you to a hospital." Wilson shook his head firmly. "Not happening. Not until this mission is complete." He patted the portable medical case beside him. "I've got what I need to manage the symptoms, and there's nothing any hospital can do at this stage except make me too sedated to finish our work. The evidence processing, we can assign others." "No one else understands the medical implications like I do," Wilson countered. "No one else can interpret the connections between the chemical exposures and the subsequent symptom patterns." His expression hardened with resolve. "This is why I saved everything, Bill. This is why I hid that container in Thunderbolt. I knew someday I'd need to establish the link conclusively. I just didn't expect to be fighting my own body while doing it." Bill recognized the determination in his friend's eyes, the same unwavering focus that had made Wilson the finest gunner in the battalion, capable of identifying and engaging targets with uncanny precision, even under the most adverse conditions. "At least let me get you set up more comfortably," Bill conceded, helping Wilson to his feet. Together, they moved to the impromptu medical station Wilson had established in a quiet corner of the workshop, where he could continue his evidence analysis while monitoring his deteriorating condition. The irony wasn't lost on either man, the doctor becoming the patient, the healer requiring healing. As Bill ensured Wilson had everything he needed, Martinez rushed into the workshop, his expression tense. "We've got movement," he reported. "The surveillance vehicles are pulling out, headed back toward the main highway." Bill straightened, instantly alert. "All of them?" "All 3, synchronized departure." "They're clearing the area," Bill realized, his tactical mind processing the implications. "Standard procedure before an operation." "What kind of operation?" Rodriguez asked, joining them after overseeing the secure storage of the media equipment. "Could be anything from a simple warrant service to a full tactical response," Bill assessed. "Depends on how Stone has framed the situation to the agencies involved." "How long do we have?" Wilson asked, professional focus momentarily overriding his physical discomfort. Hours, not days, Bill replied. Martinez, accelerate the evidence release. We need the first package public before they move. Rodriguez, secure Thunderbolt's critical components. Anything that contains or relates to the Iron Shield evidence. If they seize the tank, they can't be allowed to find the original compartment. As his crew moved to execute these directives, Bill stepped outside to survey the property. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Kentucky landscape, the pastoral beauty incongruous with the tension pervading the farm. In the distance, he could see Frank and several of his former Marine colleagues establishing observation posts at key points around the perimeter, not to resist law enforcement, but to provide early warning of approach. Bill's phone vibrated with an incoming call. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. Washington, D.C. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. Harrington. Captain. The voice was instantly recognizable despite the decades that had passed. General Maxwell Stone, the man who had ordered the Iron Shield operation and spent 30 years bearing its consequences. It's been a long time. Bill's grip tightened on the phone. Not long enough, General. Stone's chuckle held no warmth. Still direct, I see. That was always your strength as a commander. And your weakness. What do you want, Stone? To offer you a way out of the corner you've backed yourself into. Stone's tone was conversational, almost cordial. You and your crew have had your moment of protest. You've made your point. Now it's time to resolve this situation before it escalates beyond anyone's control. You mean before the truth about Iron Shield becomes public, Bill countered. A brief silence. Then, whatever you believe you know about that operation is fragmentary, taken out of context and potentially damaging to national security if misinterpreted, which is exactly what you're doing. I was there, Stone. I saw what your experimental deployment did to our own troops. I've spent 30 years watching those men die from what you exposed them to. War requires difficult decisions, Captain. Always has. You of all people should understand that. Bill's free hand curled into a fist. Don't you dare equate legitimate combat operations with using American soldiers as unwitting test subjects. Don't you dare hide behind difficult decisions when you've spent 3 decades denying those men the treatment and recognition they deserve. Stone's voice hardened. Here's what's going to happen, Harrington. In the next 24 hours, you will return the M1A1 Abrams, designated Thunderbolt, to federal custody. You will surrender all materials removed from the vehicle. You and your crew will issue a public statement acknowledging that your claims about chemical weapons testing were based on misunderstanding and combat stress. In exchange, charges will be limited to unauthorized borrowing of government property. You'll receive probation, perhaps a modest fine. Your military pensions and benefits will remain intact. And if we refuse, then you'll face federal charges, including theft of government property, possession of classified materials, conspiracy, and sedition. Your crew will be similarly charged, your pensions will be revoked, and anyone who has supported your operation will face accessory charges. Bill absorbed the threat with the calm assessment of a commander evaluating enemy capabilities. You've overlooked something, General. What's that? We don't care anymore. Bill's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Wilson is dying of cancer, likely caused by the same chemicals you exposed him to at WWII. Martinez has already lost his business to your financial pressure tactics. Rodriguez sacrificed his career when he stood with us. And me? I've lived with the knowledge of what we did, what you ordered us to do, for 30 years. There's nothing left you can take from us. Don't be dramatic, Harrington. Everyone has something to lose. Not us, not anymore. But you, General, you have everything to lose. Your stars, your position at the Pentagon, your legacy, perhaps even your freedom, if the evidence we release tomorrow is given the serious investigation it deserves. Stone's voice took on a dangerous edge. Be very careful about threats, Captain. Not threats, Stone, promises. Bill looked toward the workshop where his crew continued their preparations. Here's my counteroffer. You publicly acknowledge the Iron Shield operation. You admit that experimental chemical agents were deployed against Iraqi positions with knowledge that American forces would soon move through the affected areas. You establish a compensation fund for affected veterans and their families, and you resign your position, effective immediately. The silence that followed was profound. When Stone finally spoke, his tone had changed. The veneer of reasonable negotiation replaced by cold authority. You've made your choice, then. I made it 30 years ago in the desert, Bill replied. I just didn't have the courage to act on it until now. For what it's worth, I respected you as a commander, Harrington. Your actions at 73 Easting were textbook execution of armor doctrine. You saved lives that day. And you condemned others to slow deaths in the same campaign. That's your legacy, Stone, not mine. We'll see whose legacy survives this confrontation, Captain. Goodbye. The call ended, leaving Bill staring at the silent phone in his hand. He had no illusions about what would follow. Stone would mobilize every resource at his disposal to silence them before their evidence became public. The question was no longer if they would face a direct challenge, but when and how it would come. He returned to the workshop where his crew awaited his briefing. Stone reached out directly, he informed them, tried to negotiate our surrender. Terms? Martinez asked. Return Thunderbolt, retract our claims, accept minor charges. In exchange, our pensions and freedom remain intact. Rodriguez snorted derisively. Generous of him. And your response? Wilson asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. I countered with our terms. Public acknowledgement of Iron Shield, compensation for affected veterans, and his immediate resignation. A thin smile crossed Wilson's pale face. I'm guessing that didn't go over well. About as expected, Bill confirmed. We now have confirmation that Stone will move against us directly and imminently. Martinez, what's the status on the evidence release? First package is formatted and ready to distribute through multiple channels simultaneously. Scheduled for 0600 tomorrow unless we trigger emergency protocols. Rodriguez, Thunderbolt Security? We've removed all physical evidence from the original compartment, relocated it to secure storage off-site. If they seize the tank, they'll find nothing. Bill nodded approval. Wilson, your medical documentation? Distributed to 3 independent medical research teams specializing in chemical weapons exposure. They'll corroborate our findings regardless of what happens to us. The preparations were as thorough as circumstances allowed. Like any combat operation, they had identified objectives, secured critical assets, established contingency plans. All that remained was the execution and responding to whatever countermeasures Stone deployed. As evening approached, the farm settled into vigilant readiness. Frank's team maintained rotation at observation posts. Rodriguez's mechanics continued working on Thunderbolt systems, determined to complete as much restoration as possible before any intervention. Martinez monitored communications channels and media coverage, alert for any indication of impending action. Bill found Wilson alone in his improvised medical station, reviewing documents with methodical precision despite his obvious physical distress. You should rest, Doc, Bill advised, concern evident in his voice. Wilson glanced up, his eyes still sharp despite the pain evident in their depths. I'll rest when it's over, Captain. He gestured to the medical files spread before him. Besides, I need to finish correlating these exposure patterns. The timing signature is crucial to establishing causality. Bill settled into a chair beside his former gunner. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them comfortable with the familiarity of men who had faced death together. Did I ever tell you why I became a doctor after we got back? Wilson finally asked. Bill shook his head. I always assumed it was a natural progression from your medical training as a combat medic. That was part of it, Wilson acknowledged. But the real reason was Al-Bahar. Watching those soldiers drop from an invisible enemy, feeling so damn helpless to do anything but inject them with atropine that wasn't designed for the agent they'd been exposed to. He closed the file before him, his hands steady despite his condition. I thought if I understood medicine better, maybe I could help them. Maybe I could prove what had happened to them wasn't in their heads, wasn't stress or diet or any of the other excuses the VA kept offering. And did you? Prove it? Wilson's smile held no joy. Scientifically, yes. The evidence is conclusive. The chemical signature in those soil samples matches perfectly with the symptom patterns documented in thousands of Gulf War veterans. The correlation is undeniable to anyone with medical training who reviews the data honestly. But science doesn't always triumph over politics, over institutional inertia, over the simple human reluctance to admit terrible mistakes. Wilson's gaze met Bill's directly. That's why this mission matters so much, Captain. Not just for justice or accountability, though those are important, but because thousands of veterans are still suffering without proper treatment because the specific agent they were exposed to remains officially denied. The weight of this truth settled between them, the human cost of secrecy extending far beyond their personal sacrifices. We'll get it done, Doc, Bill promised, whatever it takes. Wilson nodded, then returned to his methodical documentation. Bill recognized the focus that had once made Wilson capable of engaging multiple targets in rapid succession, each shot placed with surgical precision. That same concentration was now directed at assembling the evidence that would finally bring truth to light. Outside, darkness fell over the Kentucky hills. In the distance, the faint sound of helicopter rotors carried on the evening breeze, too distant to identify, but a reminder that forces were gathering. The final confrontation approached, and with it, the culmination of a mission 30 years in the making. Chapter 7, The Personal Crisis. The helicopter sounds faded, leaving the farm wrapped in the nocturnal symphony of crickets and distant owls. Inside the workshop, Bill monitored their situation with the focused attention that had once kept his tank crew alive through the chaos of combat. Martinez approached, his expression grim. "Just got word from my contact at Justice. Federal marshals have been mobilized for an operation in Kentucky. No specific location mentioned, but the timing is obvious." "How many?" Bill asked, his tactical mind already calculating force ratios and response options. "At least 24, with FBI support elements. They're staging at Fort Knox." "Timeline?" "Pre-dawn, approximately 0500. Bill checked his watch, 20 to 30 hours, less than 7 hours before Stone's forces would move against them. The precision of the intelligence allowed for proper preparation, but also confirmed the seriousness of the response being organized. "They're timing it to preempt our evidence release," he observed. "Stone knows our schedule." "We have a leak?" Rodriguez asked, joining the conversation. Bill shook his head. "Not necessarily. Stone's a veteran intelligence operator. He would anticipate our timeline based on standard media cycles. The 0600 release gives morning news programs optimal time to analyze and amplify our evidence." "So we accelerate," Martinez suggested. "Release everything now." "No," Bill decided after a moment's consideration. "We stick to the original timeline, but we ensure the release happens regardless of what occurs here. Martinez, implement Protocol Echo." Martinez nodded, understanding. Protocol Echo was their contingency for exactly this scenario. Automated evidence release triggered if they were detained or communications were severed. The digital dead man switch would ensure that even if Stone's forces successfully seized Thunderbolt and apprehended the crew, the truth about Iron Shield would still reach the public. "What about evacuation?" Rodriguez asked. "Frank has escape routes mapped out. We could relocate to a secondary position before they arrive." Bill considered the option, weighing tactical advantages against strategic objectives. Evacuating would protect us temporarily, but we'd lose Thunderbolt. And this was never about avoiding consequences. It was about ensuring the truth finally comes to light. "So we stand our ground," Wilson concluded, joining them from his workstation. The doctor moved slowly, his condition visibly deteriorating, but his resolve remained undiminished. "We stand our ground," Bill confirmed, "but on our terms. This isn't a last stand, it's a calculated position of leverage. We've distributed the evidence, established dead drops, created redundant release mechanisms. Stone can seize Thunderbolt, even arrest us, but he can't stop what's coming." The strategy meeting continued, each man contributing his expertise to their defense preparations. Not physical barricades or weapons, they had all agreed from the beginning that they would not resist legitimate law enforcement with force, but informational countermeasures designed to ensure their mission succeeded regardless of their personal fates. As midnight approached, Bill stepped outside for a moment of solitude. The Kentucky sky stretched above him, stars brilliant in the absence of urban light pollution. The same stars had guided them across Iraq's featureless deserts decades earlier, unchanging witnesses to human conflicts that seemed so momentous in the moment, so fleeting in cosmic perspective. He was joined by Frank, the former Marine, moving with the quiet assurance that never quite leaves those who have operated in combat zones. "Perimeter secure," Frank reported. "My people are in position to provide early warning, but not to engage." "Good. We're not looking for a confrontation." Frank studied him with the direct assessment of a veteran who had seen both courage and fear in their rawest forms. "You sure about that, Captain? Because from where I'm standing, you've been on a collision course with Stone since that village in Iraq." Bill couldn't deny the observation. "Maybe I have, but this isn't about personal vendettas. It's about accountability, about making sure the men who suffered because of Iron Shield don't remain forgotten. And if that accountability never comes, if Stone manages to bury the truth again, It was the question that had haunted Bill through sleepless nights since they'd recovered the evidence container. The possibility that all their sacrifices might ultimately change nothing. "Then at least we tried," he answered finally. "At least we didn't stay silent when we had the chance to speak." Sometimes that's all a soldier can do, fight the battle in front of him, regardless of whether the war is ultimately won or lost. Frank nodded, understanding evident in his weathered features. "For what it's worth, I think you've already won. The evidence is out there now, distributed beyond Stone's reach. Even if he silences you, he can't silence the truth anymore." The assessment provided cold comfort as Bill returned to the workshop where his crew continued their preparations. Wilson had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping fitfully on a cot near his workstation. Martinez coordinated with their external supporters, ensuring communication channels remained secure. Rodriguez worked on Thunderbolt with single-minded focus, determined to complete as much restoration as possible before the impending intervention. Bill moved among them, offering guidance, making adjustments to their plans, ensuring each man understood his role in the coming confrontation. The command responsibilities were familiar, even comforting in their clarity. This was what he had been trained for, leading men through adversity with clear objectives and defined principles. As 0300 hours approached, Bill called them together for a final briefing. Even Wilson roused himself from his rest, joining the circle with visible effort. "In approximately 2 hours, federal forces will move against this position," Bill began, his voice steady with the authority of command. "Their objective will be to seize Thunderbolt and apprehend us before our scheduled evidence release at 0600. Our objective is to ensure that evidence reaches the public regardless of what happens here." He looked at each man in turn, the crew that had followed him through war and peace, that had trusted his leadership through the most desperate circumstances imaginable. "Protocol Echo is active," Martinez confirmed. "If we're detained or communications are severed, the complete Iron Shield documentation will automatically release to 27 independent media outlets and veterans advocacy groups." "Thunderbolt's restoration is as complete as time allowed," Rodriguez reported. "The turret is fully functional. The commander's station is restored. She's ready for whatever comes next. The medical evidence is secured and distributed," Wilson added, his voice weaker but his determination undiminished. "3 independent research teams have confirmed our findings. Stone can discredit us, but he cannot discredit the science anymore." Bill nodded approval. "Good. Now I want to be absolutely clear about our response when federal agents arrive. We will not resist. We will not obstruct. We will comply with lawful orders while asserting our rights. This is not a military operation, it's a legal and moral stand." "And if their orders aren't lawful?" Rodriguez asked, the question reflecting concerns they all shared about how far Stone might push his authority. "Then we document, we witness, and we rely on the legal system to ultimately distinguish between legitimate national security concerns and attempts to cover up wrongdoing." Bill's expression was resolute. "We are soldiers who swore an oath to the Constitution, not to any individual or administration. That oath doesn't expire with our service." The men nodded understanding. They had all internalized the military values that transcended their active duty: honor, integrity, accountability. Today, those values would be tested in ways none of them had anticipated when they'd first put on the uniform decades earlier. "One last thing," Bill added, his tone softening slightly. "Whatever happens in the coming hours, I want you all to know that commanding this crew has been the greatest privilege of my life. In the desert and here today, you've demonstrated the finest qualities of American soldiers. It has been my honor to serve with you." The formal acknowledgement brought a moment of emotional recognition among men, typically reserved in expressing such sentiments. No words were needed in response. Their presence here, 30 years after the war that had defined their lives, spoke more eloquently than any verbal affirmation could. As the briefing concluded, each man returned to his final preparations. Bill made his way to Thunderbolt, climbing carefully into the commander's position that had once been his battlefield perspective. The restored systems surrounded him: the periscopes, the communication equipment, the controls that had extended his will across the desert battlefield. From this position, he had directed fire that destroyed enemy tanks and saved American lives. From this position, he had witnessed the consequences of Stone's immoral order at Bahar. And from this position, he now prepared to face the consequences of finally exposing that long-buried truth. The night passed with the tense anticipation familiar to any soldier who has awaited combat. Each man found his own method of preparation. Rodriguez continued working on Thunderbolt systems, making minute adjustments to the restoration work. Martinez monitored communications channels, alert for any indication of the approaching operation. Wilson methodically reviewed his medical documentation one final time, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. At 04:15, Frank's voice came through on their secure radio channel. Movement detected, multiple vehicles approaching from the south access road. Estimated arrival at the main gate in 10 minutes. Bill acknowledged the report and activated their alert protocol. Lights came on throughout the workshop. The team assembled at their designated positions. Thunderbolt stood ready in the center of the space, her desert tan paint gleaming under the overhead illumination, her turret positioned in the forward orientation that signaled readiness without aggression. "Remember, we comply with lawful orders," Bill reminded them as the sound of vehicles became audible in the distance. "This confrontation will be won in courtrooms and public opinion, not here today." At precisely 04:27, the first federal vehicles reached the main gate. Through the workshop's small windows, they could see the procession: 6 SUVs with government markings, 2 prisoner transport vans, and several unmarked sedans. The operation was substantial, but not overwhelming, a measured show of force rather than a tactical assault. "No SWAT elements visible," Martinez noted, his scout's assessment still accurate after all these years. "Standard federal marshals with FBI support. They're treating this as a high-profile arrest, not a tactical situation." "Good," Bill replied. "That suggests Stone hasn't completely mischaracterized the nature of our operation." A voice amplified by the loudspeaker carried across the pre-dawn stillness. "Attention occupants of the Delgado Farm. This is the United States Marshal Service with federal agents. We have warrants for the arrest of William Harrington, Marcus Wilson, Thomas Martinez, and Carlos Rodriguez. We also have a seizure order for military equipment currently on these premises. Exit the building with your hands visible and follow instructions." Bill checked his watch. 04:30. 90 minutes until their automated evidence release. Stone's timing was precise, leaving just enough margin to potentially intercept the disclosure if they could secure all participants quickly. "Steady," Bill cautioned as Frank entered the workshop through a side door. "They've got the place surrounded," the former Marine reported. "Professional deployment, maintaining distance, establishing clear fields of fire. They're serious but not aggressive." "As expected," Bill acknowledged. "Frank, I want you and your people to stand down completely. No resistance, no interference. This is our situation to handle." Frank looked as if he might protest, then nodded reluctantly. "Understood, Captain. Good luck." As Frank departed to ensure his associates complied with these instructions, Bill turned to his crew. "Final check. Protocol echo. Active and verified," Martinez confirmed. "Countdown running. 87 minutes to automated release." "Evidence distribution?" "Complete," Wilson reported. "Physical and digital copies secured with multiple independent parties." "Thunderbolt?" Rodriguez patted the tank's flank affectionately. "Ready for inspection, Captain. All sensitive components related to Iron's shield have been removed and secured off-site." Bill nodded approval. "Then we proceed as planned. Martinez, open communication with the federal agents. Inform them we will comply with their warrants and exit peacefully in 5 minutes." As Martinez made the call, Bill climbed Thunderbolt one last time, standing in the commander's hatch to survey what might be his final moments with the machine that had carried them through hell and preserved the truth for 3 decades. His hand rested on the turret's edge, feeling the cold metal that had once been hot with desert sun and enemy fire. "Thank you, old girl," he murmured. "One last mission complete." At 04:35 precisely, the 4 men exited the workshop as agreed, their hands raised in the universal signal of non-resistance. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, casting long shadows across the Kentucky landscape as federal agents approached with weapons drawn but not aimed directly at them. "William Harrington?" the lead marshal called. "I'm Harrington," Bill confirmed, standing slightly ahead of his crew as he had always done when facing danger. "You and your associates are under arrest for theft of government property, conspiracy, and possession of classified materials. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The familiar Miranda warning continued as agents secured each man with handcuffs, not roughly, but with the professional efficiency of law enforcement officers executing a high-profile arrest. Bill noted that they were being treated as criminal suspects, not enemy combatants or terrorists, a small but significant distinction that suggested limits to Stone's influence over the operation. As they were led toward the transport vehicles, Bill caught sight of a familiar figure emerging from one of the unmarked sedans. General Maxwell Stone, immaculate in his service uniform, despite the early hour, observing the proceedings with the cold calculation of a man accustomed to power and its application. Their eyes met across the distance, commander to commander, antagonist to antagonist. No words were exchanged, none were necessary. Stone's presence confirmed what Bill had suspected. This was personal, not merely procedural. The general had come to witness his victory, to see his 3-decade secret secured once more. What Stone couldn't know, what Bill took private satisfaction in recognizing, was that the victory was illusory. In just over 80 minutes, Protocol Echo would activate. The complete Iron Shield documentation would enter the public domain. The truth Stone had buried beneath rank and regulation would finally emerge into the light of accountability. As the federal marshals secured them in separate transport vehicles, Bill caught a final glimpse of Thunderbolt through the workshop doors. Teams of agents were already surrounding her, preparing for the complex process of securing and transporting a 60-ton tank. They would be thorough, professional, meticulous in their search for the evidence container that had started this confrontation. They would find nothing. The physical evidence was long since removed, its contents digitized and distributed beyond their reach. Thunderbolt had served her purpose, preserving the truth until it could be revealed, protecting her crew one final time against forces they could not defeat directly. The transport doors closed, cutting off Bill's view of the scene. In the confined space of the prisoner compartment, separated from his crew and heading toward an uncertain legal future, Captain William Harrington allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The mission that had begun in the Iraqi desert 30 years earlier was approaching its conclusion, not with battlefield victory, but with the moral triumph of truth over expedience, of oath over obedience, of justice delayed but finally, perhaps, delivered. As the convoy departed the farm, the sun broke over the eastern hills, illuminating a new day and the final chapter in Thunderbolt's long journey from war machine to keeper of secrets to instrument of accountability. Whatever came next for Bill and his crew, prosecution, imprisonment, vindication, they had accomplished their primary objective. The thunder that had once announced their advance across the desert would soon echo again, not from cannon fire, but from the impact of truth too long suppressed, finally breaking through the barriers of official denial and institutional protection. For Captain William Iron Bill Harrington, that would be victory enough. The holding cell at the federal courthouse in Louisville was sparse but clean, its institutional gray walls a far cry from the desert tan that had defined so much of Bill Harrington's life. He sat on the metal bench, back straight despite his 63 years, eyes forward with the same steady focus that had once guided his tank through enemy territory. 6 hours had passed since their arrest at Frank's farm. 6 hours of processing, preliminary questioning, and careful silence as they exercised their right to await legal representation. 6 hours during which Protocol Echo had activated, sending the first wave of Iron Shield documentation to media outlets across the country. Stone and his people didn't know it yet, but the battlefield had already shifted. The cell door opened, admitting a woman in her 40s, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen considerable use. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes held the intensity of someone accustomed to difficult fights. "Captain Harrington," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Catherine Reeves, Veterans Legal Defense Coalition. I'll be representing you and your crew." Bill shook her hand, noting the firm grip. "We didn't arrange legal representation." "No, you didn't," she agreed with the ghost of a smile. "But approximately 4,000 veterans did. After your video went viral, they started a legal defense fund. My organization was contacted yesterday with instructions to be ready for exactly this scenario." Bill felt a wave of gratitude for the brotherhood that transcended generations and conflicts. Men and women he'd never met, who had served in different wars, different branches, had recognized the familiar contours of institutional betrayal and rallied to support the fight against it. "What's the situation?" he asked as Catherine settled onto the bench beside him. "You and your crew are facing federal charges, including theft of government property, conspiracy, and improper possession of classified materials. Serious charges, but not insurmountable." "And Thunderbolt? Seized as evidence?" currently being transported to a secure federal facility for examination. Catherine opened her briefcase, extracting a tablet. But I suspect that's the least of your concerns right now. Bill studied her carefully. What do you know about our actual mission? Catherine met his gaze directly. Officially, you're veterans trying to save a historic tank from being sold off. Unofficially, your whistleblowers exposing a 30-year cover-up of chemical weapons testing that affected thousands of American troops during Desert Storm. She paused. How close am I? Dead center, Bill confirmed. Protocol Echo activated at 0600 this morning. The first evidence package should be public by now. Catherine's smile widened slightly. It is. That's why I'm here. The initial documents hit major news outlets 90 minutes ago. CNN is running wall-to-wall coverage. Veterans groups are mobilizing in support, and several senators have already called for emergency hearings. The news was better than Bill had dared hope. The first phase of their information operation had succeeded, creating precisely the public awareness that would prevent Stone from simply burying the evidence again. What about my crew, he asked. Have you seen them? Briefly. They're being held separately, but are all in good condition. Catherine hesitated. Except Dr. Wilson. His medical situation required intervention. He's been transferred to the university hospital under guard. The doctors say his condition is stable but serious. Bill closed his eyes briefly. Doc's cancer had progressed faster than any of them had anticipated. The stress of the past week had undoubtedly accelerated his decline. I need to see him, Bill said, opening his eyes with renewed determination. That's going to be difficult given your current status, Catherine cautioned. But I'll file the motion. In the meantime, we need to discuss your defense strategy. Before she could continue, the cell door opened again. A U.S. Marshal stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. Captain Harrington, Ms. Reeves, your presence is requested in interview room 1. Catherine frowned. My client has already declined questioning until we've had adequate time to consult. This isn't questioning, ma'am. You have visitors. Bill and Catherine exchanged glances of surprise as they followed the marshal through the secure corridor. Interview room 1 was typically used for privileged conversations between defendants and their legal team, not for outside visitors. The mystery deepened when they entered the room to find 3 individuals waiting. An older woman in professional attire, a middle-aged man in a senator's pin, and a military officer wearing the insignia of a 4-star general. Captain Harrington, the senator said, rising to his feet. I'm Senator James Collins, Veterans Affairs Committee. This is Dr. Eleanor Mitchell from the National Armor Museum, whom I believe you know, and General Howard Phillips, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Bill acknowledged each with a nod, his tactical mind assessing this unexpected development. The presence of such high-ranking officials suggested the situation was evolving rapidly, in ways Stone might not have anticipated. Please sit, Captain, General Phillips directed, his voice carrying the natural authority of high command. We have much to discuss in limited time. As Bill and Catherine took seats across the table, Senator Collins placed a folder before them. These documents were released to major media outlets this morning. They appeared to detail a classified operation codenamed Iron Shield, conducted during Operation Desert Storm, an operation involving the deployment of experimental chemical agents against enemy positions, with foreknowledge that American troops would subsequently move through the affected areas. Bill said nothing, waiting for the senator to continue. These documents further allege that then-Colonel Maxwell Stone authorized this deployment as a field test of protective equipment, essentially using American soldiers as unwitting test subjects, and that when these soldiers began exhibiting symptoms consistent with chemical exposure, a systematic cover-up was initiated that has persisted for 30 years. Collins leaned forward. Captain Harrington, as the commander on the ground during Iron Shield, we need to know, are these documents authentic? Bill met the senator's gaze steadily. They are, Senator, every page. General Phillips exhaled slowly, the sound carrying the weight of institutional betrayal. You understand the gravity of these allegations, the implications for the military, for veterans' care, for our international standing? I've understood the gravity for 30 years, General, Bill replied, his voice firm but not confrontational. The question is whether the institutions we served are finally prepared to acknowledge the truth and make it right. Dr. Mitchell spoke for the first time. That's why we're here, Captain Harrington. The evidence you've released has created what military planners would call an overwhelming force scenario. Too many people know now. Too many questions are being asked. The old containment strategy is no longer viable. Senator Collins nodded agreement. The president has been briefed. An independent investigation is being established. General Stone has been placed on administrative leave pending review of his actions. The news struck Bill with almost physical force. After 3 decades of silence, of institutional resistance, of powerful men protecting their legacy at the expense of suffering veterans, the dam was finally breaking. "What does this mean for Captain Harrington and his crew?" Catherine asked, ever focused on her client's immediate situation. General Phillips and Senator Collins exchanged glances. "That's what we're here to discuss," Phillips said. "The charges against you all are technically valid. You did take government property. You did possess classified materials. But context matters." "What the general's trying to say," Dr. Mitchell interjected with characteristic directness, "is that prosecuting decorated veterans for exposing a 3-decade cover-up of unethical weapons testing would be a public relations nightmare for both the military and the current administration." Senator Collins nodded. "Precisely, which is why we're authorized to offer terms." "What kind of terms?" Bill asked, his commander's instinct for negotiation surfacing. "A formal agreement," Phillips explained. "You and your crew will provide complete testimony about Iron Shield and the evidence you've preserved. In exchange, all charges will be dropped. Your military records and benefits will remain intact. And most importantly, a comprehensive medical program will be established for all veterans affected by the experimental agents deployed during Operation Desert Storm." It was more than Bill had dared hope for. Not just personal exoneration, but the systematic acknowledgement and care for thousands of veterans who had suffered without recognition for 30 years. "What about Thunderbolt?" he asked, thinking of the tank that had protected them in war and preserved the truth in peace. Dr. Mitchell smiled. "The National Armor Museum will receive full funding for its continued operation. Thunderbolt will be returned to display with a new exhibit detailing both her combat history and her role in bringing the Iron Shield truth to light." The offer was comprehensive, addressing every aspect of their mission, almost too perfect, which triggered Bill's tactical caution. "And Stone, what happens to him?" The room grew noticeably quieter. General Phillips adjusted his uniform cuff before answering. "General Stone will retire, effective immediately. His role in Iron Shield and the subsequent cover-up will be documented in the official record. Whether criminal charges follow will depend on the independent investigation's findings." Bill considered the terms carefully. Stone would lose his position and his legacy would be tarnished, but he might escape the full legal consequences of his actions. It wasn't perfect justice, but then perfect justice rarely existed outside of storybooks. "My crew needs to be consulted," Bill decided, "particularly Dr. Wilson. This was never just my mission." "Of course," Senator Collins agreed. "Dr. Wilson's medical situation adds urgency, however. The sooner we have your collective agreement, the sooner we can implement the Veterans Care Program that could help thousands like him." The implicit pressure was clear, but not unreasonable. Every day that passed meant more suffering for veterans affected by Iron Shield and similar operations. "I'll speak with them immediately," Bill promised. "But I need your assurance that Dr. Wilson will receive the best possible care regardless of our decision." "Already arranged," Dr. Mitchell said. "The nation's leading oncologist specializing in chemical exposure cases is being flown in from Johns Hopkins. He'll oversee Dr. Wilson's treatment personally." Bill nodded appreciation. "Then I believe we have the framework for an agreement. Let me consult with my crew, and we'll provide our response by the end of the day." The meeting concluded with formal handshakes and the sense of historical inflection points being navigated. As Catherine gathered her materials, Bill found himself momentarily alone with Dr. Mitchell. "You knew," he said quietly, "when you gave me access to Thunderbolt at the museum. You knew what we were really looking for." Eleanor's expression softened with the admission. "I suspected. There have always been rumors about certain vehicles returning from Desert Storm with more than battle damage. When Stone specifically targeted Thunderbolt for removal during the museum restructuring, it confirmed those suspicions. You took a significant risk. No greater than the risk you took in the desert 30 years ago." Eleanor's eyes held the respect of one professional for another. "Some missions transcend regulations, Captain. You taught me that." Before Bill could respond, Catherine returned to escort him back to his holding cell. The events of the morning had altered the battlefield dramatically. Stone's carefully constructed wall of silence and denial was crumbling, exposing the truth that had been buried beneath institutional protection for 3 decades. As Bill settled onto the cell's metal bench once more, He allowed himself a moment of reflection. The mission wasn't complete, the agreement still needed his crew's approval, and implementation would undoubtedly face bureaucratic resistance, but the primary objective had been achieved. The truth about Iron Shield would finally be acknowledged. The veterans who had suffered from its effects would receive recognition and care. Thunderbolt, the steel beast that had carried them through the war and preserved their evidence through decades of peace, would stand as a monument not just to battlefield prowess, but to moral courage, to the oath that extended beyond active service, to defend the Constitution, to protect one's brothers in arms, to uphold the principles that defined American military service at its best. For Captain William Iron Bill Harrington, career soldier and tank commander, that represented victory more meaningful than any battle honor or commendation. It was, at long last, mission accomplished. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The University Hospital in Louisville hummed with the controlled chaos typical of major medical centers. Bill moved through the polished corridors, flanked by a federal marshal who maintained a respectful distance. His status had evolved from prisoner to cooperating witness in the 6 hours since his meeting with Senator Collins and General Phillips, though formal processing of the agreement remained ongoing. Wilson's room was in the oncology ward, its door distinguished by the presence of a second marshal standing guard. The man nodded recognition as Bill approached, stepping aside to allow entry while maintaining his vigilant position. The room beyond was bathed in afternoon sunlight, filtering through vertical blinds. Sophisticated medical equipment surrounded the bed where Marcus Doc Wilson rested, his once powerful frame diminished by disease, but his eyes still sharp with awareness as Bill entered. "Captain," Wilson greeted him, voice weaker than Bill had ever heard it, but still carrying the steady calm that had guided their tank's main gun through the fog of war. "Guess I missed the party." Bill moved to the bedside, taking the chair position there. "Just some bureaucratic maneuvering, Doc. Nothing you haven't seen before." Wilson's lips curved in a knowing smile. Protocol echo worked then. Like a precision strike, major media coverage, congressional interest, Pentagon damage control. They're offering terms. "What kind?" Bill outlined the agreement proposed by Senator Collins and General Phillips. The drop charges, the Veterans Care Program, the preservation of Thunderbolt with her full story acknowledged. Wilson listened intently, his medical training evident in the way he processed each element with analytical precision. When Bill finished, the former gunner was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window where Louisville's skyline stretched toward the horizon. "They're letting Stone retire," he observed finally. "No guarantee of criminal charges." "That's the weakness in their offer," Bill acknowledged. "But thousands of sick veterans will finally get recognition and specialized treatment. That was always our primary objective." Wilson nodded slowly. "The mission parameters: secure acknowledgement of Iron Shield, ensure care for affected veterans, preserve Thunderbolt in her story." His eyes returned to Bill's. "By those metrics, it's mission accomplished." "That's my assessment. But this was never a unilateral command decision. We all took the risk together. We all decide together." "Martinez and Rodriguez?" "Both support accepting the terms. They're being processed for release now." Wilson's expression softened with something like peace. "Then we have consensus. The Steel Hammer crew completes its final mission as we began, in unanimous accord." The formality of the language carried an undercurrent of emotion that both men felt, but neither needed to articulate directly. 30 years of shared history, of burden carried together, of trust forged in combat and tempered through decades of civilian life. These created bonds that transcended conventional expression. "The doctors say you're responding well to the new treatment protocol," Bill said, changing the subject to the immediate concern. Wilson's smile held no illusion. "The doctors are being optimistic for the visiting dignitary's benefit. This cancer has been 30 years in the making, Captain. A few new medications won't reverse its course now. The specialist from Johns Hopkins is excellent, and I appreciate the gesture, but my professional assessment is unchanged." Wilson reached for the water cup beside his bed, his hand trembling slightly. "I've got weeks, not months. But that's all right. I've made peace with it." Bill helped steady the cup, the role reversal striking him powerfully. The commander now supporting the crew member who had once kept them all alive with his medical skills. "I haven't," Bill admitted quietly. "That's because you've always been stubborn about accepting parameters you couldn't change." Wilson's tone held affection rather than criticism. Desert Storm, Iron Shield, my diagnosis. Some situations don't respond to command authority, no matter how well applied. The truth of the observation hung between them, acknowledged by Bill's silence. What matters, Wilson continued, is that we completed the mission. The evidence is public, the cover-up exposed. The affected veterans will finally get the recognition and care they deserve. He paused, his breath coming more laboriously. That's a legacy worth leaving, Captain. Before Bill could respond, a soft knock preceded the door opening. A nurse entered, followed by Martinez and Rodriguez. Both men had changed from their detention clothing into hospital-provided scrubs, their expressions reflecting the strange mixture of triumph and solemnity that characterized the day's developments. The gang's all here, Wilson observed with a weak smile. Steel Hammer, reunited one last time. The four men who had once manned Thunderbolt through the war's most intense tank battle gathered around Wilson's hospital bed, different now in age and circumstance, yet fundamentally unchanged in their connection to each other. The tank crew brotherhood had endured through 3 decades of civilian life, sustaining each through personal and professional challenges, culminating in this final mission that had drawn on all their collective skills. Martinez, ever the strategic planner, updated them on the formal processing of their agreement with the government. Rodriguez, the practical mechanic, detailed the arrangements being made for Thunderbolt's return to the museum. Each report was delivered with the concise efficiency of military briefings, habits formed in combat that had never fully faded. As evening approached, Wilson's energy began to wane visibly, the conversation taking more effort than his weakened condition could sustain. The others prepared to depart, understanding without being told that their gunner needed rest more than company. "We'll come back tomorrow," Rodriguez promised, his hand resting briefly on Wilson's shoulder. "The whole crew." Wilson nodded, though something in his expression suggested he understood tomorrow might bring different circumstances. "It's been an honor serving with you all, in the desert and here. Best damn tank crew that ever rolled through hell." "Best damn tank crew," the others echoed, the familiar affirmation carrying 3 decades of shared meaning. As Martinez and Rodriguez departed, Bill lingered a moment longer. The commander's responsibility for his crew never truly ended, a reality both men acknowledged without needing to articulate it. "I'll be fine, Captain," Wilson assured him. "Just need some rack time before the next mission." Bill nodded, respecting his gunner's dignity by accepting the familiar military phrasing rather than confronting the medical reality directly. "See you at dawn briefing, Doc." "Roger that." With a final nod, Bill departed, joining the others in the hospital corridor, where a hospital administrator waited to escort them to temporary accommodations arranged as part of their agreement. The day's events had exhausted them all, physically and emotionally, leaving little energy for anything beyond the most immediate considerations. As they settled into the hospital's VIP suite, converted to house the 3 of them overnight, Bill found himself standing at the window, watching nightfall transform Louisville's skyline into a constellation of artificial stars. Behind him, Rodriguez and Martinez conversed quietly, discussing practical arrangements for the coming days: transportation, accommodations, coordination with their legal representation. Bill's mind was elsewhere, processing the day's dramatic shift in their situation. The mission he had carried for 30 years was approaching completion. The truth about Iron Shield would finally be acknowledged officially. The veterans affected by Stone's unconscionable experiment would receive recognition and specialized care. Thunderbolt would be preserved with her full story intact, a monument to both battlefield valor and moral courage. By any objective measure, they had succeeded against overwhelming odds. Yet the victory felt incomplete, tempered by Wilson's declining health and the likelihood that Stone would escape full accountability for his actions. The perfect justice Bill had once imagined, Stone facing criminal charges, public disgrace, perhaps even imprisonment, would likely give way to the messy compromise that characterized most real-world resolutions. Martinez joined him at the window, reading his expression with the perceptive awareness that had once made him an exceptional scout. "You're thinking it's not enough," Martinez observed. "That Stone gets to retire with his pension while Wilson dies from what Stone did to him." Bill didn't deny the assessment. "Doesn't sit right." "No, it doesn't." Martinez leaned against the window frame, his business attire incongruous in their current circumstances. "But perfect justice is a luxury rarely afforded in war or peace. We exposed the truth. We secured care for thousands of veterans who've been suffering without recognition. We preserved Thunderbolt in her story. That's more than most whistleblowers ever accomplish. The perspective was logical, pragmatic, characteristic of Martinez's approach to complex problems. Bill recognized its validity even as part of him resisted accepting anything less than complete accountability for what Stone had done. There's something else you should know, Martinez added more quietly. Something I discovered during our media monitoring. Stone has a son, Army captain currently deployed in the Middle East. By all accounts, a good officer, respected by his troops. Your point, Bill asked, though he already sensed the direction of Martinez's thinking. Stone's public disgrace affects more than just him. His son will carry that legacy too, through no fault of his own. The observation struck home, forcing Bill to confront the wider implications of his desire for perfect justice. In war, collateral damage was sometimes unavoidable, but always regrettable. The same principle applied here. Stone's son was innocent of his father's crimes, yet would inevitably suffer from their exposure. I'm not suggesting we change course, Martinez clarified. The truth needed to come out. The veterans deserved recognition and care. I'm just saying that even justice has ripple effects beyond our initial targets. Bill nodded, absorbing the perspective. His military career had taught him repeatedly that perfect solutions rarely existed in complex situations. The art of command lay in making the best decisions possible within existing constraints, accepting the limitations while still striving for the most just outcome achievable. Get some rest, he told Martinez. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. As his crew settled into sleep, Bill remained wakeful, his commander's mind continuing to process the day's developments and anticipate what might come next. Stone had been outmaneuvered but not defeated entirely. The general's decades in Washington would have built networks of influence and protection that might yet mitigate his personal consequences, even as the broader truth about Iron Shield became impossible to suppress. Bill's tactical instincts warned that their victory, while significant, remained incomplete until the formal agreements were signed and implemented. Experience had taught him that the period between verbal agreement and documented execution was often the most vulnerable, when opponents might seek last-minute advantages or escape clauses. These concerns accompanied him as he finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleep bringing not rest but dreams of the desert, of Thunderbolt charging across sand toward an objective that constantly shifted, of Wilson's voice in his headset reporting targets that could never quite be brought into focus, of Stone watching from a distance as American soldiers collapsed from an invisible enemy. Morning arrived with the controlled chaos of a major hospital beginning its day. Bill woke to find Martinez already dressed and engaged with their legal representative via video call, while Rodriguez coordinated with museum staff about Thunderbolt's eventual return and restoration. The machinery of resolution was in motion, professionals in various fields executing their responsibilities with the same disciplined efficiency that had once characterized their tank crew operations. Bill's first priority was checking on Wilson. The marshal assigned to him provided escort to the oncology ward, where the morning shift change was underway. The guard outside Wilson's door remained at his post, though his demeanor had shifted from vigilant restriction to respectful protection. Wilson was awake when Bill entered, sitting up slightly in his hospital bed, reviewing medical charts on a tablet with the professional interest of a physician rather than the personal concern of a patient. He looked marginally better than the previous day, his color improved, his breathing less labored. "Morning, Captain," he greeted Bill, setting aside the tablet. "Sleep well in the VIP accommodations?" "Well enough," Bill replied, taking the now familiar chair beside the bed. "You're looking better." Wilson offered a small smile. "The Johns Hopkins protocol is good science. Won't change the ultimate outcome, but it's managing the symptoms effectively. I might get a few more weeks of clarity than I expected." The pragmatic assessment was quintessential Wilson. Clinical, objective, accepting reality while focusing on the parameters that could still be influenced. It was the same mentality that had made him an exceptional gunner, capable of distinguishing between targets that could be engaged effectively and those that were beyond practical range. "The formal agreement should be ready for our signatures by noon," Bill informed him. "Senator Collins is personally overseeing the final language to ensure there are no bureaucratic escape clauses." "Good," Wilson nodded. "And the Veterans Care Program?" "Initial framework already established. They're using your medical documentation as the foundation for treatment protocols. The first outreach to affected veterans begins next week." Satisfaction flickered across Wilson's features. That was always the main objective, Captain. Everything else was secondary. Before Bill could respond, the room door opened. A doctor entered, followed by a nurse and, unexpectedly, General Howard Phillips, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs who had participated in yesterday's negotiations. Dr. Wilson, Captain Harrington, Phillips greeted them formally. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, General, Wilson replied with the ingrained courtesy of a former serviceman addressing superior rank despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Phillips nodded to the medical staff, who efficiently checked Wilson's vital signs before departing to give the men privacy. Once they were alone, the general's formal demeanor softened slightly. I wanted to provide a personal update, Phillips explained. The president has been briefed on the full Iron Shield documentation. He's authorized an executive order establishing the Gulf War Veterans Chemical Exposure Treatment Initiative, effective immediately. Dr. Wilson's medical evidence will serve as its foundation. The news represented even more rapid progress than Bill had anticipated. Bureaucratic systems typically moved with glacial slowness, especially when acknowledging past institutional failings. The accelerated timeline suggested high-level recognition of both the injustice done and the urgent need for remediation. That's good news, General, Wilson acknowledged, his physician's passion for patient care evident despite his weakened condition. The affected veterans have waited too long already. Phillips nodded agreement. The VA is already identifying candidates for the initial treatment cohort. We estimate approximately 50,000 veterans will qualify based on documented exposure patterns and symptom presentation. And the official acknowledgement of Iron Shield? Bill asked, focusing on the accountability aspect that had driven their mission from the beginning. The Department of Defense will issue a formal statement this afternoon, confirming the operation occurred and acknowledging that ethical protocols were violated. Phillips' expression reflected the institutional discomfort with such admissions. It won't satisfy everyone, Captain. Some will say it doesn't go far enough in assigning individual responsibility. Meaning Stone, Bill clarified. Phillips didn't deny it. General Stone submitted his retirement paperwork this morning, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. The ongoing investigation will determine whether his actions met the threshold for criminal charges. The carefully worded update confirmed Bill's suspicion that Stone would likely escape the most severe consequences of his actions. Institutional protection, even when significantly weakened by public exposure, still provided insulation that ordinary soldiers rarely enjoyed. He gave the orders, Bill stated, the simple fact cutting through bureaucratic qualification. He knew American troops would move through areas exposed to our own chemical agents. He sanctioned the cover-up that denied care to thousands of affected veterans for 30 years. Phillips didn't dispute the assessment. The investigation will establish the full extent of accountability. That's all I can say at this stage, Captain. The conversation might have escalated toward confrontation had Wilson not intervened with the calm authority that had once steadied their tank crew through the chaos of combat. General, we appreciate your personal involvement in expediting the treatment program, Wilson said. That was always our primary objective. Accountability matters, but care for the affected veterans matters more. The redirection was skillful, de-escalating tension while maintaining focus on the most critical outcome. Bill recognized his gunner's wisdom in picking the battles that could be won rather than expending limited resources on those that might prove ultimately futile. Phillips seemed to appreciate the intervention as well. The agreement documents will be delivered for your signatures within the hour. Once executed, all charges against you and your crew will be formally dismissed. Thunderbolt will be returned to the National Armor Museum with full recognition of her historical significance, both in combat and in preserving this evidence. Thank you, General, Wilson acknowledged, and please convey our appreciation to Senator Collins for his support. As Phillips departed, Bill found himself studying Wilson with renewed respect. Even now, weakened by disease and confined to a hospital bed, the former gunner maintained the steady composure and strategic awareness that had made him exceptional in their tank crew. You let Stone off the hook, Bill observed, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity about Wilson's calculation. Wilson shook his head slightly. Not at all, Captain. I simply recognize which battles we've already won and which we haven't. Stone's career is over, his legacy permanently tarnished. The truth about Iron Shield is public. The veterans will receive care. Those were our mission objectives, and we've secured them. But Stone himself escapes criminal prosecution. Perhaps that's for the investigation to determine. Wilson's expression reflected the philosophical acceptance that often comes with facing mortality. But consider this, Captain. Would prosecuting Stone personally change anything for the veterans who've suffered all these years? Would it bring back those who died without recognition? Or would it simply satisfy our desire for perfect justice in an imperfect world? The questions were rhetorical but powerful, forcing Bill to confront his own motivations. Was his desire to see Stone criminally charged truly about justice for the affected veterans? Or was it more personal, the commander's instinct to ensure that those who violated sacred trusts paid an appropriate price? Before he could formulate a response, Martinez appeared at the door, tablet in hand, his expression reflecting controlled urgency. Captain, Doc, the agreement documents have arrived. Rodriguez is reviewing them with Ms. Reeves now, but there's something else you should see. He entered the room, offering the tablet to Bill. On screen was a news broadcast showing General Maxwell Stone at a hastily arranged press conference. The chyron beneath identified it as live footage. Stone's making a statement, Martinez explained. Completely unexpected, according to our media contacts. Bill and Wilson watched as Stone, impeccable in his dress uniform despite the circumstances, addressed assembled reporters with the confident authority that had characterized his military career. After 42 years of service to this nation, I am announcing my retirement from active duty, effective immediately, Stone began, his voice steady. This decision comes amidst recent allegations regarding Operation Iron Shield, conducted during Desert Storm in 1991. He paused, his expression grave but composed. While I cannot comment on classified operations or ongoing investigations, I can say this. Throughout my career, I have made decisions based on the intelligence available and the mission requirements at hand. Some of those decisions, viewed through the lens of hindsight or without full operational context, may appear questionable. That is the burden of command. Bill felt his jaw tighten at the carefully crafted non-admission that acknowledged nothing while positioning Stone as simply a commander making difficult decisions. However, Stone continued, surprising them all, if actions taken under my authority resulted in harm to American service members, the responsibility is ultimately mine, regardless of institutional authorizations or chain of command approvals. The statement stopped short of admitting specific wrongdoing regarding Iron Shield, but represented a significant departure from the complete denial that had characterized the previous 3 decades. I have submitted to the appropriate authorities all records in my possession regarding operations conducted during Desert Storm. I will cooperate fully with any investigation into these matters, and I express my deepest respect for the veterans who have raised these concerns, particularly Captain William Harrington and his crew, whose service to this nation has been exemplary. The unexpected acknowledgement created a ripple of murmurs among the assembled press corps. Stone raised a hand for silence before continuing. While I cannot undo decisions made 3 decades ago under the exigencies of wartime command, I can ensure that any veterans affected by those decisions receive the recognition and care they deserve. To that end, I am personally establishing a foundation dedicated to supporting research and treatment for Gulf War veterans suffering from unexplained illnesses. He concluded with a brief statement about his pride in military service and confidence in the ongoing leadership of the armed forces, then departed without taking questions, leaving the assembled journalists calling after him with the predictable queries his statement had generated. Martinez muted the broadcast as Stone disappeared from view. That was unexpected. Damage control, Bill assessed, getting ahead of the official duty statement, framing the narrative on his terms. Maybe, Wilson conceded, but it's still more acknowledgement than we've seen in 30 years. And that foundation he mentioned, if properly funded, it could supplement the government program significantly. Bill considered this perspective. Stone's statement had been carefully crafted to avoid explicit admission of wrongdoing while still accepting generalized responsibility. It was the statement of a man who understood that complete denial was no longer viable, but who sought to shape the terms of his accountability. The question is whether it's genuine contrition or strategic positioning, Bill mused aloud. Does it matter? Wilson countered. The outcome for the veterans remains the same. Recognition, care, support. Those were our objectives, Captain. The state of Stone's soul was never part of the mission parameters. The observation was quintessential Wilson. Practical, focused on tangible outcomes rather than abstract justice. It reflected the medical professional's priority of healing over punishment, of future care over past accountability. Before the conversation could continue, Catherine Reeves arrived with the formal agreement documents for their review and signatures. The legal language had been meticulously crafted to ensure that all charges against them would be permanently dismissed, that Thunderbolt would be returned to the museum with full recognition of her historical significance, and that the Veterans Care Program would be established with guaranteed funding for at least 10 years. As Bill signed the documents, officially concluding their 3-decade mission, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction at achieving their primary objectives, lingering frustration that Stone might escape the full measure of accountability, pride in his crew's unwavering commitment through challenges that would have broken lesser men, and profound gratitude for Thunderbolt, the steel beast that had carried them through war and preserved the truth through decades of peace. The formal signing complete, Catherine departed to file the documents with federal authorities, leaving the former tank commander and his gunner alone once more. "So that's it," Bill said quietly. "Mission complete." Wilson nodded, his expression peaceful despite the medical equipment surrounding him. "Mission complete, Captain. Thunderbolt preserved. Truth acknowledged. Veterans recognized. Not a bad outcome for 4 old tank crewmen against the entire military establishment." The assessment was accurate, if understated. Against overwhelming institutional resistance, they had forced acknowledgement of a 30-year cover-up. Against the calculated obfuscation of powerful interests, they had established the truth about Iron Shield and secured care for its victims. Against the natural tendency of systems to protect themselves, they had created accountability where none had existed before. Not perfect justice, perhaps, but significant justice nonetheless. As afternoon sun streamed through the hospital window, illuminating the room where one phase of their long journey was ending, Bill found himself at peace with the outcome. The perfect resolution he had once imagined might never materialize, but the essential objectives had been secured. The mission that had begun in the desert 30 years earlier was finally reaching conclusion. Not in battlefield victory, but in the moral triumph of truth acknowledged, suffering recognized, and responsibility accepted. For Captain William "Iron Bill" Harrington, veteran tank commander and guardian of an inconvenient truth, that represented victory enough. Chapter 10. Steel Legacy. 3 months later, the National Armor Museum gleamed under perfect autumn sunshine. Newly renovated with the funding secured through their mission, the facility had been transformed from a neglected repository facing closure to a vibrant educational center celebrating America's armored heritage. Bill stood before Thunderbolt, restored to her desert glory and positioned as the centerpiece of a new exhibit. Beyond the battlefield, the tank that preserved the truth. Beside the magnificent machine, photographs and documentation told the dual story of her combat service during the Desert Storm and her later role in exposing the Iron Shield operation. Visitors moved respectfully around the display, many of them veterans who recognized the significance of both aspects of Thunderbolt's history. Some paused to shake Bill's hand or thank him for his persistence in bringing the truth to light. Others simply stood before the tank in silent appreciation, understanding, without needing explanation, what such machines had meant to the men who crewed them in combat. Martinez joined Bill, impeccable in a charcoal suit that reflected his return to business success. The construction company he had nearly lost during their mission was rebuilding, supported by contracts from veteran-owned businesses and the goodwill generated by his role in exposing Iron Shield. "Impressive turnout," Martinez observed, nodding toward the crowded museum galleries. "Eleanor says attendance has tripled since reopening." "People respond to authenticity," Bill replied. "They recognize when an institution honors the full truth, not just the convenient parts." They moved through the exhibits together, past displays detailing Thunderbolt's combat history, her years of silent preservation of crucial evidence, and the final mission that had brought accountability after 3 decades of institutional denial. The narrative was presented without sensationalism, but with unflinching honesty, exactly as Bill had insisted when consulting on the exhibit's development. Rodriguez waited for them near a technical display explaining Thunderbolt's restoration. The former loader had found his own path forward after their mission, establishing a specialized workshop dedicated to preserving military vehicles with historical significance. His expertise, honed over decades of mechanical engineering, was now being passed to a new generation through an apprenticeship program for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. "Captain Martinez," he greeted them with the easy familiarity of men who had shared experiences beyond ordinary description. They've done her justice, haven't they? Bill nodded, his hand resting momentarily on Thunderbolt's flank, as it had countless times during combat operations 3 decades earlier. The steel felt different now, no longer hot with desert sun and battle exertion, but cool and dignified in museum preservation. Yet the connection remained, the ineffable bond between a commander and the machine that had carried him through humanity's darkest moments. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs just arrived, Martinez reported, ever the scout maintaining situational awareness. The ceremony will begin in 20 minutes. The event they had gathered for represented the formal establishment of the Gulf War Chemical Exposure Treatment Center, a specialized facility dedicated to caring for veterans affected by Iron Shield and similar operations. The center embodied the most meaningful outcome of their mission. Not just truth acknowledged, but healing finally offered to those who had suffered without recognition for 30 years. As they made their way toward the museum's main auditorium, Bill's thoughts turned to Wilson. The brilliant gunner who had preserved the evidence that made their mission possible had lived just long enough to see the initial veterans treatment program implemented. He had died 6 weeks after their agreement with the government, his medical expertise contributing to the treatment protocols even in his final days. The funeral had drawn hundreds, fellow veterans, former patients, medical colleagues, and the countless individuals whose lives Wilson had touched through his quiet competence and unwavering integrity. Bill had delivered the eulogy, honoring not just the exceptional gunner who had once directed Thunderbolt's main gun with surgical precision, but the physician who had dedicated his life to healing others even as his own health failed. He would have appreciated this, Rodriguez said quietly, intuiting the direction of Bill's thoughts. The center opening, Thunderbolt preserved, the truth acknowledged. Mission complete, as he would say. Mission complete, Bill echoed, the familiar military phraseology carrying deeper resonance in this context. The auditorium was filled to capacity when they arrived. On stage, a podium had been arranged before a backdrop depicting the new treatment center's facade. Seated in the front row were Eleanor Mitchell, Senator Collins, and somewhat surprisingly, General Howard Phillips, representing the military's formal acknowledgement of past failures and commitment to present accountability. Bill and his remaining crew members took their designated seats as the ceremony began. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs spoke eloquently about the nation's obligation to those who served, particularly when institutional failures had contributed to their suffering. Senator Collins detailed the bipartisan legislation that had established permanent funding for the treatment center and similar facilities to be constructed in other regions. When Bill was introduced to speak, he approached the podium with the straight-back posture ingrained through decades of military service. At 63, he remained imposing, the natural authority of command evident in his bearing despite the civilian clothes he now wore. 30 years ago, he began, his voice carrying through the hushed auditorium, a tank crew designated Steel Hammer rolled across the Iraqi desert in an Abrams we called Thunderbolt. Our mission was to engage enemy armor, secure objectives, and protect American forces advancing behind us. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled dignitaries and veterans. What we didn't know then was that one of our assignments, Operation Iron Shield, involved securing an area that had been exposed to experimental chemical agents deployed by our own forces. American soldiers subsequently moved through that contaminated zone, many developing symptoms that would later be collectively termed Gulf War Syndrome. The blunt acknowledgement created a ripple of reaction through the audience. Though the information was now public knowledge, hearing it stated so directly by a commander who had been present carried different weight. For 3 decades, these veterans were told their symptoms were psychological, the result of stress or other factors. Their suffering was real, but the cause was denied. The evidence was buried beneath layers of classification and institutional protection. Bill's gaze settled momentarily on General Phillips, who met it steadily, neither challenging nor avoiding the implicit criticism of the system he now represented. Today, we begin to make that right. Not perfectly. Nothing can restore the years of health lost, the careers derailed, the families stressed by unexplained illnesses, but meaningfully through recognition, treatment, and the simple human dignity of acknowledging truth. He gestured toward the image of the treatment center behind him. This facility represents more than medical care, though that is its primary function. It represents our national commitment to facing difficult truths, to honoring obligations even when delayed, to ensuring that those who serve are never again sacrificed to expediency or institutional self-protection. Bill concluded by recognizing the contributions of his crew, particularly Wilson, whose medical documentation had provided the foundation for the treatment protocols now being implemented. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, reflecting appreciation not just for the formal remarks, but for the 3-decade mission of accountability that had made this moment possible. As the ceremony concluded and the official opening of the treatment center was commemorated with the traditional ribbon cutting, Bill found himself approached by a younger man in civilian attire, whose bearing nonetheless marked him as military. "Captain Harrington," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Michael Stone, General Stone's son." The introduction created a moment of surprise that Bill managed to conceal behind the professional courtesy ingrained through his military career. "Captain Stone," he acknowledged, noting the rank Martinez had mentioned months earlier. "Former captain now," Michael clarified. "I resigned my commission last month." The information added another layer of complexity to the already unexpected encounter. "I'm sorry to hear that," Bill said genuinely. From all reports, the younger Stone had been an exemplary officer, untainted by his father's ethical compromises. Michael's expression reflected no resentment, only a certain resigned acceptance. It was the right decision under the circumstances. The Iron Shield revelations. They created a situation where my continued service would have been complicated for all concerned. Bill understood the unspoken reality. Though Michael bore no responsibility for his father's actions, the shadow of those decisions would have followed him throughout his military career, creating questions about favoritism if he advanced and suspicions of punishment if he didn't. "That's a significant sacrifice," Bill observed, "one you shouldn't have had to make." "Perhaps not in a perfect world." Michael's smile held no bitterness. "But we deal with reality as it exists, not as we wish it to be, a principle I believe you understand well, Captain." The assessment was accurate. Bill's military career had been defined by precisely that pragmatic approach to difficult circumstances, accepting limitations while still striving for the best achievable outcome. "What will you do now?" Bill asked, genuinely interested in the younger man's path forward. "I've accepted a position with the Veterans Health Initiative, using my military experience to help improve care delivery systems for those who served." Michael's expression reflected quiet determination. "It's not commanding troops, but it's still serving a mission I believe in." The choice seemed fitting, not atonement for sins he hadn't committed, but positive contribution in an area where his skills and background could create meaningful impact. It reflected a character distinct from his father's, defined by service rather than ambition. "Your father?" Bill asked, the question unavoidable given the context of their meeting. "Retired to his lake house in Minnesota, cooperating with the ongoing investigation while maintaining his public position that Iron Shield was authorized through proper channels." Michael's tone suggested neither defense nor accusation, simply acknowledgement of reality. The foundation he established for Gulf War veterans is genuinely funded and operational, whatever his motivations in creating it. The information aligned with what Bill had heard through other channels. Stone had retreated from public life, his legacy permanently tarnished, but his legal culpability still undetermined as investigations continued. The foundation he had established, perhaps from genuine remorse, perhaps from strategic calculation, was providing additional resources beyond the government programs, supporting research and treatment for veterans affected by chemical exposure during Desert Storm. "I wanted you to know," Michael continued after a brief pause, "that I understand why you did what you did, why you preserved that evidence, why you forced the acknowledgement after all these years." His gaze met Bill's directly. "It was the right thing, Captain Harrington. Difficult for my family, but necessary for the thousands who suffered without recognition." The statement, offered without qualification or resentment, reflected a moral clarity that commanded respect. This young man had lost his military career and seen his family name tarnished, yet maintained the perspective to recognize the larger principles at stake. "I appreciate that, Captain Stone," Bill replied, using the military rank intentionally, honoring the service that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond the younger man's control. As Michael departed with a final handshake, Bill found himself reflecting on the complex ripples of accountability, how actions taken decades earlier continued to influence lives beyond those directly involved, creating obligations that transcended conventional timelines. Martinez rejoined him, having observed the exchange from a respectful distance. Stone's son? Bill nodded, resigned his commission, working with veterans' health programs now. Collateral damage, Martinez observed quietly, echoing their conversation months earlier about the wider implications of exposing Iron Shield. Collateral healing, perhaps, Bill countered. He's found his own mission, distinct from his father's shadow. The nuanced perspective reflected Bill's evolution through the Iron Shield mission, from seeking perfect justice with clear villains and heroes to recognizing the complex interplay of institutional failures, individual decisions, and the possibility of redemption through different paths. As the formal events concluded and attendees dispersed toward the reception area, Bill made his way back to Thunderbolt. The magnificent tank stood silent but eloquent, her steel presence a testament to both battlefield prowess and moral courage. The commander's hatch that Bill had once occupied remained open, inviting visitors to imagine the perspective of those who had fought from within such mechanical beasts. Bill placed his hand once more on Thunderbolt's flank, feeling the connection that transcended the decades between desert combat and museum preservation. The tank had protected them in war, preserved their evidence through years of silence, and finally helped deliver truth that powerful interests had sought to suppress. "Thank you, old girl," he murmured, the words meant for no audience but perhaps understood at some level by the machine that had been more than metal and machinery to the men who crewed her. As he stepped back, Bill noticed a young veteran in a wheelchair being guided toward Thunderbolt by a museum docent. The man's condition suggested he might be among those affected by the very exposures their mission had finally brought to light. One of thousands who would now receive recognition and specialized treatment because 4 aging tank crewmen had refused to let truth remain buried. The sight brought a sense of completion that transcended the formal ceremonies and official acknowledgments. This was the true measure of their mission's success, not in personal vindication or institutional accountability, but in tangible difference made to those who had suffered without recognition for 3 decades. Captain William "Iron Bill" Harrington, veteran tank commander and keeper of an inconvenient truth, watched as the next generation engaged with both Thunderbolt's history and the accountability she had finally helped secure. The mission that had defined his later years was complete. The truth was acknowledged. The affected veterans recognized. Thunderbolt preserved as both war machine and moral testament. Steel rusted, armor decayed. But the principles they had fought to uphold, truth, accountability, care for those who served, would endure, strengthened rather than diminished by the acknowledgement of past failures and the commitment to present healing. In the quiet satisfaction of mission accomplished, Bill found the peace that had eluded him since that fateful day in the Iraqi desert 30 years earlier. Not perfect justice, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. Not complete victory, but victory enough. For the commander of Steel Hammer and Thunderbolt, that legacy of steel would endure long after the men who had forged it were gone.